She was a virgin, raised in the silence of a convent that rejected her for dreaming of blood. He was a lonely millionaire, haunted by the unexplained death of his pregnant wife. When she entered his room and whispered, "Devour my body," time stopped. If you enjoy love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment telling us where you are listening from. On the windswept moors of Yorkshire, where ancient stones cut through the grey sky like broken teeth, stood Ravenshollow Manor. The locals in the village of Thornwick spoke of it only in whispers, crossing themselves when the wind carried the scent of roses from its overgrown gardens. They said the windows wept with each storm, that the walls groaned like old bones settling, and that no one, absolutely no one, had managed to stay employed there for more than a fortnight. But Vincent Ashworth remained. Always alone, always haunted, always consumed by the kind of silence that devours a man from within. At 48, Vincent was no ordinary millionaire. His fortune had been built on the ruins of others, families displaced from their ancestral homes so he could erect glass towers that pierced London's skyline like silver needles. The tabloids called him ruthless. The business world whispered that he was cursed. Both were right, though neither understood the full extent of either truth. Vincent had inherited more than money and moorland. The Ashworth legacy was stained with generations of men marked by obsession, possession, and an insatiable hunger that could never be fed. Since his wife Isabella had been found floating in the manor's ornate bathtub, her pregnant belly still and cold, her dark eyes fixed on something only she could see, Vincent had become something less than human. He had not touched another woman since that October night 3 years ago. He had sealed the upper floors of the manor, and he had covered every mirror in the house with black cloth, unable to bear seeing what looked back at him. The morning that would change everything began like all the others. Vincent sat in his study, surrounded by architectural plans for his next conquest, a block of Victorian terraces in Manchester that he intended to tear down for a shopping complex. His fingers traced the blueprints with the practiced precision of a surgeon, marking which families would need to be relocated, which businesses would close, which history would be erased. It was work that required a particular kind of coldness, and coldness was all he had left. The doorbell's ancient chime echoed through Ravenshollow's Gothic halls at precisely 9 in the morning. Vincent looked up from his plans, irritation flickering across his sharp features. Mrs. Pemberton, his elderly housekeeper, had quit the previous week after claiming she'd heard crying from the sealed rooms upstairs. The staff agency in Leeds had promised to send a replacement, but Vincent held little hope. They never lasted. The house itself seemed to reject them, as if it were waiting for something or someone else. Through his study's tall windows, Vincent watched a young woman approach the heavy oak doors. Even from a distance, there was something different about her. She didn't hurry or hesitate as the others had. Her movements held a strange grace, as if she were walking through water rather than across the gravel drive. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to poverty, but not broken by it. Lucy Rivers was 24, though the hardships of her life had carved a premature wisdom into her delicate features. Abandoned as an infant on the steps of St. Catherine's Home for Foundling Children in Liverpool, she had grown up surrounded by the echoes of other people's unwanted stories. The nuns had been kind but distant, teaching her to find solace in work rather than hope. She had learned to clean as if it were a form of prayer, to polish brass until it gleamed like halos, to scrub floors until they reflected heaven itself. At 18, she had left the Foundling Home with nothing but a worn suitcase and an address in Manchester, where she'd been promised work as a domestic. For 6 years she had moved from position to position, caring for elderly invalids who saw ghosts in their final days, cleaning the homes of wealthy widows who spoke to dead husbands, tending to children whose parents had abandoned them to nannies and boarding schools. Lucy had developed an unusual tolerance for the strange and sorrowful. Perhaps it was her own abandonment that made her sensitive to the lost and broken things of the world. Or perhaps there was something deeper, something that had been written into her bones before she was even born. She had always felt as though she were waiting for something, though she could never name what it might be. The position at Ravenshollow Manor had come through an agency that specialized in what they delicately called challenging placements. The salary was generous enough to be suspicious, and the isolated location would have deterred most sensible young women. But Lucy had run out of both options and fear. She needed work, and she had learned long ago that the houses others found disturbing often felt like home to her. Vincent opened the door himself, something he hadn't done in years. The sight of Lucy Rivers standing on his threshold sent an unexpected jolt through his chest. Not desire exactly, but recognition. As if his body remembered something his mind had forgotten. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, her voice soft but steady. Her accent carried traces of Liverpool working-class roots, but her diction was careful, educated by nuns who had insisted on proper speech. "I'm Lucy Rivers from the Thornbridge Agency." Up close, she was even more striking. Her skin was pale as churchyard marble, but her eyes held depths that seemed to contain multitudes. They were the kind of eyes that suggested she had seen more than most people twice her age, and had made peace with whatever darkness she'd witnessed. "Miss Rivers," Vincent's voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "I wasn't expecting you quite so early. I took the first train from Manchester, sir. I thought it best to arrive with the day." She glanced past him into the shadowed entrance hall, and something flickered across her expression. Not fear, but a strange kind of relief. "It's a beautiful house." Most people found Ravenshollow oppressive. The Gothic architecture, the way shadows gathered in corners even during daylight, the persistent scent of roses that had no visible source. It all combined to create an atmosphere of genteel decay that made visitors uncomfortable. But Lucy stepped inside as if she were coming home after a long journey. "Beautiful," Vincent repeated, studying her face for any sign of the unease that usually overcame newcomers. "That's not the word most people use." Lucy's lips curved in the faintest smile. "I've always preferred places that have stories to tell, sir. The pretty ones rarely have anything interesting to say." Vincent found himself staring at her mouth, at the way her bottom lip was slightly fuller than the top, at how her teeth were small and white and perfect. He forced himself to look away, disturbed by the direction of his thoughts. He hadn't noticed a woman's mouth in 3 years. He hadn't allowed himself to notice anything about women at all. "I should show you to your quarters," he said abruptly, turning toward the servants' stairs. Mrs. Pemberton prepared them before she left. "You'll find everything you need." "Of course, sir." Lucy followed him through the maze of corridors, her footsteps silent on the worn Persian runners. As they walked, Vincent found himself acutely aware of her presence behind him. There was something about her that seemed to calm the house itself. The usual creaking of floorboards was muted. The drafts that perpetually plagued the halls had stilled. The servants' quarters were on the ground floor, in what had once been the butler's pantry. Vincent pushed open the door to reveal a small but comfortable room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the kitchen gardens. "Will this suffice?" he asked, though he knew it was rather modest compared to what a woman of Lucy's obvious refinement might expect. "It's perfect," she said, and meant it. She had lived in much worse places, but more than that, the room felt right, safe, as if it had been waiting for her specifically. Vincent cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the domesticity of the situation. He wasn't accustomed to dealing directly with staff. Isabella had always handled such matters, charming the help with her warm laugh and easy manner. But Isabella was gone, and he had never learned the art of casual conversation with those who worked for him. "Your duties will be straightforward," he began, falling back on the formal distance of employer and employee. "The ground floor and my study require daily attention. The kitchen and dining room as needed. The upper floors—" He paused, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "The upper floors are not to be disturbed." "Under any circumstances," Lucy nodded. "Of course, sir. Are there any other areas I should avoid?" "The east wing is unused. Some of the floorboards are unsound." It wasn't entirely untrue, though Vincent's real reasons for keeping people away from that part of the house were far more complex. "I work from home, so you may encounter me throughout the day. I prefer not to be interrupted unless absolutely necessary." "Understood." Lucy's dark eyes studied his face with an intensity that made Vincent uncomfortable. Not because she was impertinent, but because she seemed to see more than he was prepared to reveal. "Will you be taking your meals in the dining room, sir?" "I can prepare them if you'd like." "I don't require much attention," Vincent said, though the idea of home-cooked meals held an unexpected appeal. He had been living on whatever Mrs. Pemberton had left in the freezer, and whatever he could have delivered from the village. "But if you're inclined to cook, I won't object." "I enjoy cooking," Lucy said. "It's one of the things the nuns taught well, along with making things clean and beautiful." There was something in the way she said beautiful that made Vincent's chest tighten. He turned away abruptly, afraid she might see something in his expression that would betray the inappropriate thoughts beginning to form in his mind. "I'll leave you to settle in," he said. "If you have questions, you can find me in the study." Vincent retreated to his sanctuary, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary. He stood with his back pressed against the heavy wood, trying to calm the sudden acceleration of his heartbeat. It was simply the surprise of having another person in the house after weeks of solitude. Nothing more than that. But as he returned to his architectural plans, Vincent found himself unable to concentrate. His thoughts kept drifting to Lucy Rivers, the way she had looked at Ravenshollow as if it were a cathedral rather than a mausoleum, the quiet confidence in her voice, the strange sense of familiarity that had swept over him the moment she'd spoken his name. In the servants' quarters, Lucy unpacked her few belongings with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to temporary lodgings. But as she arranged her worn books on the small shelf and hung her meager wardrobe in the narrow closet, she felt something she had never experienced before, the sensation of belonging. Ravenshollow Manor seemed to breathe around her, its old walls settling with what sounded almost like sighs of contentment. Lucy had always been sensitive to the moods of houses. Some were angry, some were sad, some were simply tired. But this house felt alive in a way that should have been frightening but wasn't. It felt like home. As she explored the ground floor, learning the layout and assessing what needed to be done, Lucy found herself drawn again and again to the sealed staircase that led to the upper floors. The area was cordoned off with rope, and dust sheets covered everything in sight, but there was something about the forbidden space that called to her, as if someone upstairs were whispering her name. She forced herself to focus on her work instead. The main hall needed a thorough cleaning, and the study where Mr. Ashworth spent his time was layered with the kind of masculine neglect that suggested he had been caring for himself poorly. Lucy threw herself into the familiar rhythm of domestic work, finding peace in the simple act of restoring order to chaos. But even as she polished silver and swept floors, her thoughts kept returning to her enigmatic employer. Vincent Ashworth was nothing like the men she had encountered in her previous positions. There was something broken about him, something that went deeper than ordinary grief or loneliness. It was in the way he held himself, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. It was in his eyes, which looked like they had seen something terrible and couldn't forget it. Lucy had always been drawn to damaged things. Perhaps it came from being damaged herself, abandoned, unwanted, raised by people who cared for her out of duty rather than love. She recognized the signs of a soul that had been shattered and poorly mended, held together by will alone. As the afternoon wore on, she prepared a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables, the kind of comfort food that could warm a house as well as a body. When she knocked softly on the study door to announce that dinner was ready, Vincent looked up from his work with the dazed expression of a man who had forgotten the world existed outside his own thoughts. "You didn't need to trouble yourself," he said, but Lucy caught the way his eyes lingered on the mention of food. "It's no trouble, sir. I made plenty." She hesitated, then added, "You look as though you haven't been eating properly." Vincent's mouth twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Is that your professional opinion, Miss Rivers?" "It's my observation as someone who has cared for people who forgot to care for themselves," she replied with gentle honesty. They ate in the formal dining room, a cavernous space dominated by a table that could have seated 20. Vincent sat at the head, Lucy at his right hand, though the distance between them felt both intimate and vast. The meal was excellent, simple but perfectly prepared, seasoned with the kind of intuitive skill that came from years of making much from little. "This is remarkable," Vincent said after his first bite. It was the first home-cooked meal he had eaten since Isabella's death, and the warmth of it seemed to unlock something in his chest that had been frozen for too long. "Thank you." Lucy's cheeks flushed with pleasure at the compliment. "I learned from Sister Margaret at the Foundling Home. She believed that food prepared with care could heal more than hunger." "A Foundling Home." Vincent studied her face, seeing new layers in her careful composure. "That must have been difficult." Lucy shrugged, a gesture that tried to minimize old pain. It gave me purpose, learning to care for others who had been forgotten, making places beautiful for people who had forgotten how to see beauty. There was something in her words that resonated with Vincent's own sense of isolation. Though his had been chosen rather than imposed, he found himself wanting to know more about this quietly remarkable young woman who had appeared at his door like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying. "And your family?" he asked, then immediately regretted the question when he saw her expression tighten. "I never knew them," she said simply. "But I've made my peace with that. Sometimes the family we're born to isn't the one we're meant to have." Vincent nodded, understanding more than she realized. The Ashworth legacy had been more curse than blessing, and he had often wondered if he might have been happier born to simpler circumstances. But then he never would have met Isabella, and despite everything that had followed, he couldn't regret loving her. As if reading his thoughts, Lucy asked quietly, "Was your wife very beautiful?" The question caught Vincent off guard. He stared at her, wondering how she had known about Isabella. Then he realized it was obvious. A man his age, living alone in a house clearly designed for a family, with rooms sealed off as if they were shrines. "Yes," he said finally. "She was luminous. Everything she touched seemed to come alive. I'm sorry for your loss." Lucy's voice held genuine compassion, the kind that came from understanding grief intimately. "Losing someone you love changes the very air you breathe." Vincent looked at her sharply, surprised by the insight. Most people offered empty platitudes about time healing all wounds, or Isabella being in a better place. But Lucy seemed to understand that some losses carved permanent hollows in a person, spaces that could never be filled with anything else. "Yes," he said. "It does." They finished the meal in comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of shared understanding rather than lack of conversation. As Lucy cleared the dishes, Vincent found himself reluctant to return to his study, to the solitude that had been his only companion for so long. "Miss Rivers," he said as she prepared to return to the kitchen, "tomorrow I'll be traveling to Manchester on business. I'll be gone for several days. Will you be comfortable here alone?" Lucy paused, considering. The thought of being alone in Ravenshollow should have been daunting, but instead it felt like an opportunity. As if the house wanted to tell her its secrets, and Vincent's absence would give it permission to speak. "I'll be fine, sir," she said. "I'm accustomed to solitude." Vincent nodded, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with her answer. "The village is only 2 miles if you need anything. Mrs. Hartwell at the post office can arrange for supplies to be delivered." "Thank you." Lucy met his eyes, and for a moment, the careful distance between employer and employee seemed to dissolve. They were simply two lonely people who had recognized something familiar in each other. "Good night, Miss Rivers," Vincent said, his voice softer than it had been all day. "Good night, Mr. Ashworth." As Vincent climbed the stairs to his solitary bedroom, he found himself thinking about Lucy's dark eyes and the way she had looked at his house as if it were beautiful. For the first time in 3 years, Ravenshollow felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home. In her small room, Lucy lay awake, listening to the night sounds of the old house. The wind in the eaves, the settling of ancient timbers, the distant sound of what might have been crying but was probably just the manor's old pipes. She should have been nervous, alone in this vast, unfamiliar place. Instead, she felt safer than she had in years. As sleep finally claimed her, Lucy dreamed of a woman with dark hair floating in bath water that reflected stars instead of ceiling. The woman's eyes were open and knowing, and when she spoke, her voice seemed to come from very far away. "You've come at last," the woman said. "I've been waiting so long for you to come home." Lucy woke before dawn with tears on her cheeks and a strange certainty that her life at Ravenshollow Manor was going to change everything. She thought she knew about love, loss, and the thin places where the living and the dead touch fingers across the veil. The next morning brought a transformation in both the weather and Vincent's demeanor. Yorkshire's notorious grey skies had given way to pale sunlight that streamed through Ravenshollow's tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the air. Vincent appeared at breakfast dressed for travel, a charcoal wool coat over a black suit that emphasized the sharp angles of his face and the premature silver threading through his dark hair. Lucy had risen early to prepare his meal, driven by an impulse she couldn't quite name. She told herself it was simple professionalism, the desire to prove herself capable in her new position. But as she watched Vincent eat the eggs she had prepared, noting how he savored each bite as if good food were a foreign concept, she recognized something deeper at work. The same instinct that had made her gentle with broken birds as a child, that had drawn her to care for the most difficult patients in her previous positions. Vincent Ashworth was damaged goods, and Lucy Rivers had always specialized in mending what others had given up as hopeless. "The train for Manchester leaves at 10, Vincent said, consulting the gold pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather. "I should be back by Friday evening, though business sometimes runs longer than anticipated." "What sort of business, if you don't mind my asking?" Lucy refilled his coffee cup, noting how her proximity made his shoulders tense. "Property development. There's a block of Victorian houses that—" He paused, studying her face. Most people looked at him with either fear or resentment when he described his work. Lucy's expression held only polite interest. "That need to be evaluated for potential redevelopment." "Ah," Lucy nodded, though something in her tone suggested she understood exactly what redevelopment meant for the families currently living in those Victorian houses. "Well, I hope your business goes smoothly, sir." Vincent found himself oddly reluctant to leave. The thought of returning to Ravenshollow to find Lucy gone, as so many employees had vanished before her, created an unexpected hollow sensation in his chest. But she had given no indication of discomfort with the house or her duties. If anything, she seemed more at home here than he felt most days. "Miss Rivers," he said as he prepared to depart, "there are some things you should know about the house while I'm away." Lucy looked up from where she was clearing his breakfast dishes, her hands stilling on the delicate china. "What sort of things?" Vincent hesitated, aware of how his next words would sound. But 3 housekeepers had quit after experiencing what they claimed were supernatural disturbances, and he owed Lucy some warning, even if he couldn't bring himself to believe their stories. The house settles considerably at night. Old foundations, you understand. Sometimes it can sound like— He struggled for words that wouldn't make him sound like a madman, like someone walking in the upper floors. "It's just the wood contracting as temperatures change." Lucy nodded solemnly, though Vincent caught something knowing in her dark eyes. "Old houses have their own language," she said. "I've learned to listen without being frightened." "The East Wing is genuinely unsafe," Vincent continued. "Some of the floorboards have rotted through. I've been meaning to have it repaired, but—" He gestured vaguely, the unfinished sentence hanging between them like an admission of neglect. "I understand, sir. I won't venture where I'm not welcome." There was something in her phrasing that made Vincent look at her more closely. Not welcome rather than not allowed, as if she recognized that houses, like people, had boundaries that should be respected rather than simply feared. The taxi from the village arrived precisely at 9:30, its engine coughing in the morning air like an old man with too many cigarettes in his past. Vincent gathered his briefcase and overnight bag, then paused at the front door, looking back at Lucy as she stood in the entrance hall. In the morning light streaming through the stained glass panels above the door, she looked almost ethereal. The colored glass cast jewel-toned shadows across her pale skin, sapphire and ruby and gold, making her appear less like a flesh-and-blood woman and more like a figure from a medieval painting. The sight stirred something in Vincent's chest that he had thought dead and buried with Isabella. "Take care of yourself. Miss Rivers," he said, the words carrying more weight than a simple farewell. "And you, Mr. Ashworth?" Lucy's smile was small but genuine. "Travel safely." Vincent nodded and stepped out into the Yorkshire morning, leaving Lucy alone with Ravenshollow Manor and whatever secrets it chose to share. The first day passed quietly. Lucy threw herself into her work with the methodical thoroughness that had served her well in previous positions. She scrubbed floors until they gleamed, polished silver until it reflected her face like water, and organized Vincent's study with the reverent care of a librarian handling rare manuscripts. But as the afternoon wore on, Lucy became increasingly aware that she was not alone in the house. It wasn't anything she could define precisely, a shift in the light when no clouds crossed the sun, the sound of a door closing when no doors had been opened, the persistent scent of roses in rooms where no flowers bloomed. Another woman might have been frightened. Lucy found herself oddly comforted. She had always been sensitive to the emotions that lingered in places where intense feelings had been experienced. Joy left a golden warmth that could persist for years. Anger created cold spots that made people unconsciously avoid certain corners. And grief. Grief soaked into walls like water into wood, creating an atmosphere that the perceptive could feel like a physical weight. Ravenshollow Manor was saturated with grief, but it was not a malevolent sadness. It was the grief of love lost, of promises unfulfilled, of a future that had been stolen rather than simply ended. Lucy recognized it because she had carried a similar sorrow her entire life, the grief of abandonment, of wondering what might have been if her parents had chosen differently. As evening approached, Lucy prepared a simple meal for herself, eating alone at the massive dining room table while shadows gathered in the corners like old friends. She had grown accustomed to solitary meals during her years at various positions, but something about eating in Vincent's chair felt both transgressive and oddly intimate. She could imagine him sitting there across from her, his intense gaze softened by candlelight, his severe expression relaxed by good food and wine. The thought surprised her with its clarity and specificity. In all her previous positions, Lucy had maintained careful professional boundaries, viewing her employers as responsibility rather than individuals worthy of personal interest. But Vincent Ashworth had gotten under her skin in a way that should have been concerning. Perhaps it was their shared isolation, his chosen, hers imposed, that created a sense of kinship. Or perhaps it was simply that Lucy had never encountered a man so obviously in need of care, who was simultaneously so reluctant to accept it. The combination of strength and vulnerability was dangerously appealing to someone with her particular weakness for damaged things. After dinner, Lucy found herself drawn to Vincent's study. She told herself she was simply ensuring everything was properly organized for his return, but in truth, she was hungry for clues about the man who employed her. The room was starkly masculine, leather and dark wood and the lingering scent of expensive cologne, but it was the personal touches that drew her attention. On Vincent's desk sat a silver-framed photograph of a woman with luminous dark eyes and a smile that seemed to light the entire image. This would be Isabella, the wife whose death had transformed Vincent from whatever he had been into the haunted man Lucy knew. She was indeed beautiful, but it was more than physical attractiveness. There was a warmth in her expression, a vitality that radiated even through the static medium of photography. Lucy found herself studying the image with an intensity that bordered on obsession. There was something familiar about Isabella's face, something that stirred a recognition Lucy couldn't place. Perhaps it was simply that she had known other women with that particular combination of strength and softness. Or perhaps a sound from upstairs interrupted her examination, the unmistakable creak of footsteps on old floorboards. Lucy froze, her heart jumping in her chest. Vincent had been clear that the upper floors were sealed, that no one should be up there. But someone or something was walking around with the unhurried gait of someone entirely at home. Lucy set down the photograph and moved to the study door, listening intently. The footsteps continued, pacing back and forth in what sounded like the room directly above Vincent's study. Not the frantic scurrying of rats or the random settling of old timber, but the deliberate movement of someone deep in thought. She should have been terrified. Any sensible woman would have locked herself in her room and waited for Vincent's return before investigating. But Lucy had never been entirely sensible, and 3 years of caring for the dying and the desperate had given her a healthy respect for the thin places where the physical and spiritual worlds intersected. Instead of retreating, Lucy climbed the main staircase to the first-floor landing, where heavy rope blocked access to the upper floors, and dust sheets covered everything like shrouds. The footsteps had stopped, but the air itself seemed to pulse with an expectant energy, as if something was waiting for her decision. "I know you're there," Lucy said softly, feeling only slightly foolish for speaking to empty space. "I don't mean any harm. I'd like to understand." The silence stretched between heartbeats, and then Lucy heard something that made her blood freeze in her veins. A woman's voice, distant and echoing, speaking words she couldn't quite make out, but whose tone was unmistakably sad. It sounded like someone calling for help from the bottom of a well. Lucy took a step toward the rope barrier, then another. The voice came again, clearer this time, and the words sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. "Lucy," the voice whispered. "Lucy, you've come home at last." The sound of her own name, spoken by someone who shouldn't exist, should have sent Lucy running. Instead, she found herself reaching for the rope that blocked the staircase, her fingers trembling not with terror, but with a strange sense of inevitability. Whatever was upstairs knew her, had been waiting for her, and Lucy had spent her entire life feeling as though she were waiting for something to find her. But before she could cross the barrier, the front door of Ravenshollow Manor slammed shut with such violence that the entire house shuddered. The sound echoed through the halls like a gunshot, and when the reverberations faded, the oppressive atmosphere lifted as suddenly as a fever breaking. Lucy stood alone on the landing, her hand still extended toward the rope, wondering if she had imagined the entire encounter. But the scent of roses hung heavy in the air, and she could swear she felt someone watching her with a mixture of approval and anticipation. That night, Lucy dreamed again of the woman in the bathtub, but this time the dream was different. The woman, Isabella, though Lucy had never been told her name, stood beside the tub rather than floating in it. She was pregnant, her belly round and full beneath a white nightgown that seemed to glow with its own light. "He loved me," Isabella said, her voice carrying the weight of profound sadness. "But love wasn't enough to save me, or our child, or him." "What happened to you?" Lucy asked, though some part of her already knew the answer would be terrible. "The same thing that happens to all the women who love Ashworth men too deeply," Isabella replied. "We lose ourselves in their darkness." "But you—" She reached out to touch Lucy's face with fingers that felt like ice. "You might be strong enough to save him. Strong enough to save us all." Lucy woke with the taste of roses on her tongue, and the absolute certainty that her arrival at Ravenshollow Manor had been orchestrated by forces beyond human understanding. She was here for a purpose that went deeper than employment, deeper than mere survival. She was here to heal something that had been broken for generations. But healing Vincent Ashworth would require her to navigate dangers she was only beginning to understand. And some kinds of healing demanded sacrifices that could destroy the healer as thoroughly as the disease. Vincent's business in Manchester proved more complicated than anticipated. The Victorian terraces he intended to demolish were protected by a preservation order he hadn't expected, and the residents had organized with a ferocity that surprised him. Usually his offers were generous enough to overcome sentimental attachments to old buildings, but these families had lived in their homes for generations, and money couldn't buy what they weren't willing to sell. He found himself thinking of Lucy as he sat in sterile hotel rooms and attended tense meetings with city planners. Her words about places having stories to tell echoed in his mind as he looked at the ornate facades scheduled for destruction. For the first time in his career, Vincent wondered what stories these buildings might have, what lives had been lived within their walls, what memories would be erased along with the bricks and mortar. It was an uncomfortable shift in perspective for a man who had built his fortune on the principle that progress required sacrifice. But Lucy Rivers had a way of making him question assumptions he had never thought to examine. Meanwhile, at Ravenshollow Manor, Lucy was discovering that solitude in the ancient house was anything but lonely. The supernatural encounters she had initially attributed to an overactive imagination were becoming impossible to ignore. Doors opened and closed of their own accord. The scent of roses intensified in rooms where she found herself thinking of Vincent. And every night she dreamed of Isabella. The dreams were becoming more vivid, more specific. Lucy learned that Isabella had been an artist, that she had painted watercolors of the Yorkshire countryside in a studio on the 3rd floor. She had been 7 months pregnant when she died, carrying Vincent's son, and her death had been neither accident nor suicide, but something far more sinister that Vincent had spent 3 years trying to forget. On the 3rd day of Vincent's absence, Lucy's curiosity finally overcame her caution. Armed with a flashlight she had found in the kitchen, and driven by dreams that felt more like memories, she crossed the rope barrier and climbed to the upper floors of Ravenshollow Manor. The air grew colder with each step, and the scent of roses became so overwhelming it was almost narcotic. Dust sheets covered furniture like ghosts, and Lucy's footsteps echoed in the silence with an almost musical quality. She found herself moving toward the room where she had heard the footsteps, guided by an instinct that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with destiny. Vincent's bedroom was a shrine to frozen grief. Isabella's clothes still hung in the wardrobe, her jewelry scattered across the dressing table, as if she had just stepped out for a moment. The bed was made with military precision, the coverlet so tight it looked as though no one had slept there in years, which Lucy realized was probably exactly the case. But it was the adjoining bathroom that made Lucy's breath catch in her throat. The bathtub was enormous, a Victorian monstrosity of white porcelain and gold fixtures that dominated the room like an altar. The taps were tarnished with age, and water stains marked the bottom of the tub in patterns that looked almost like symbols. Lucy approached the tub slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was where Isabella had died, where Vincent had found his pregnant wife floating like Ophelia in her watery grave. The tragedy of it hit Lucy like a physical blow, and she found herself gripping the edge of the tub to steady herself. That was when she saw it, a piece of paper wedged between the tub and the wall, yellowed with age and water damage, but still partially legible. Lucy extracted it carefully, recognizing Isabella's handwriting from the shopping lists and notes she had found scattered throughout the house. The fragment was part of a letter, though to whom it had been addressed was unclear. But the words that remained were enough to make Lucy's blood run cold. The dreams are getting stronger. I see her face every night now, the woman who will come after me. She has dark eyes like mine, and she understands what it means to be alone. Vincent doesn't believe me when I tell him about the family curse, about the price that must be paid for Ashworth prosperity. But she will believe. She will know what I know, feel what I feel. And perhaps she will be strong enough to break what I was too weak to. The letter ended there, torn or water-damaged beyond recovery. But Lucy stared at the words with growing horror and recognition. The woman who will come after me. Dark eyes like mine. Someone who understands what it means to be alone. Isabella had known about her. Somehow, impossibly, Vincent's dead wife had foreseen Lucy's arrival at Ravenshollow Manor 3 years before it happened. You found it. Lucy spun around, expecting to see Vincent returned early from Manchester. Instead, she found herself facing a woman she recognized from photographs and dreams. Isabella Ashworth, as beautiful and luminous in death as she had been in life. The ghost stood in the bathroom doorway, her white nightgown pristine despite the circumstances of her death, her dark hair flowing loose around her shoulders. Lucy should have screamed, should have run, should have done any number of things that a rational person would do when confronted with the impossible. Instead, she found herself asking the question that had been burning in her mind since her first night in the house. What happened to you? Isabella smiled, the expression infinitely sad but somehow relieved. I wondered if you would be able to see me clearly. The others never could, the housekeepers who came before you. They sensed something, but they couldn't focus enough to truly perceive. I've always seen things others couldn't, Lucy said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. The nuns said it was a gift, though it never felt like one. Gifts rarely do, until we understand their purpose. Isabella moved into the bathroom with the fluid grace of smoke, coming to stand beside Lucy at the tub where she had died. I was like you once, sensitive to the spaces between worlds, drawn to the lonely and the broken. It's what made Vincent fall in love with me, though he never understood it completely. How did you die? Lucy asked, though part of her was afraid to know. Isabella's expression darkened, grief giving way to something harder and more complex. The Ashworth men have always been cursed, though they prefer to call it blessed. Their prosperity comes at a price that is paid by the women who love them. Every generation, the family's guardian spirit demands a sacrifice, a woman who will give up her life to ensure the continuation of their wealth and power. Lucy felt the blood drain from her face. You were sacrificed. I was supposed to be, Isabella said, her voice growing stronger with remembered anger. The pregnancy was part of the ritual, new life to replace the old, the ultimate offering to appease forces that should never have been awakened. But I discovered the truth too late, when the child was already growing inside me and the spiritual bonds were too strong to break. But you died anyway. Isabella nodded. her form flickering like candlelight in a draught. I tried to fight it. I thought if I could just hold on until the baby was born, if I could find a way to break the pattern. But the curse is older and stronger than any individual will. In the end, I was pulled under just as all the others had been. Lucy gripped the edge of the tub harder, her knuckles white with tension. And Vincent? Does he know? Vincent knows pieces of the truth, but he spent 3 years convincing himself that my death was a tragic accident rather than the inevitable conclusion of a bargain his ancestors made centuries ago. Isabella's ghostly form moved closer to Lucy, close enough that the temperature around them dropped noticeably. He loved me desperately, but he was also terrified of me, of what I represented, what I might cost him. "Why are you telling me this?" Lucy asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because you're here for the same reason I was," Isabella said softly. "The family guardian has been calling to you your entire life, shaping events to bring you to Raven's Hollow Manor at precisely the right moment. You feel it, don't you? The sense that you've been waiting for something, that your real life was always meant to begin here." Lucy couldn't deny it. From the moment she had stepped into the house, she had felt a rightness that had nothing to do with employment and everything to do with destiny. Even now, standing in the room where Isabella had died, she felt more at home than she ever had in her 24 years of life. But it doesn't have to end the same way. Isabella continued, her voice growing urgent. "I've had 3 years to study the curse from this side of death, to understand its mechanisms and limitations. There might be a way to break it, but it will require sacrifices of a different kind." Before Lucy could ask what she meant, the sound of a car door slamming echoed from the courtyard below. Vincent had returned from Manchester earlier than expected, and Lucy was standing in the one place he had explicitly forbidden her to go. "Go," Isabella whispered, already beginning to fade. "He mustn't know about this conversation yet." "But Lucy," her voice was barely audible now, like wind through autumn leaves. "Be careful how deeply you let yourself fall. Love can be salvation or damnation. And with Ashworth men, the line between them is thinner than spider's silk." Lucy barely managed to slip back downstairs and remove the barrier rope before Vincent's key turned in the front door. She was dusting the entry hall with forced casualness when he appeared, his dark coat damp from the Yorkshire drizzle and his expression grim. "Miss Rivers," he said, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested he was suppressing strong emotions. "I hope everything has been quiet in my absence." "Quite quiet, sir," Lucy replied, hoping her face didn't betray the supernatural encounter she had just experienced. "How was your business in Manchester?" Vincent's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Complicated, more complicated than I anticipated." He shrugged out of his coat, and Lucy noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands moved with barely contained frustration. "I may need to reconsider the entire project." Lucy took his coat, her fingers brushing his for just a moment as she did. The contact sent an electric shock through both of them, brief but unmistakable. Vincent's eyes met hers, and Lucy saw something there that made her breath catch. Not just awareness of her as a woman, but something deeper and more dangerous, hunger, need, the kind of desperate longing that could consume a man if he wasn't careful. "Sir?" she asked softly, concerned by the intensity of his stare. Vincent shook himself as if waking from a trance. "Forgive me. I'm tired from the journey." But he didn't look tired. He looked like a man struggling against instincts he couldn't control or understand. "I've prepared dinner," Lucy said, falling back on the safety of domestic routine. "Nothing elaborate, but I thought you might be hungry after traveling." "That's very thoughtful." Vincent's voice was rough, as if his throat had gone dry. I should change clothes first." He headed for the staircase, then paused with his foot on the first step. "Miss Rivers? You said everything was quiet." "No. Disturbances? No sounds from the upper floors?" Lucy met his gaze steadily, weighing truth against discretion. "Old houses settle, sir, especially in the damp, but nothing that troubled me." Vincent nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Of course. I'll be down shortly." As Vincent disappeared upstairs, Lucy retreated to the kitchen to finish preparing their meal, but her hands shook as she worked, and she found herself replaying every moment of her conversation with Isabella. The curse, the sacrificial women, the suggestion that love could be either salvation or damnation for the Ashworth men. And most disturbing of all, the growing certainty that she was already falling under Vincent's spell. Drawn to his darkness, with the same fatal attraction that had doomed Isabella and generations of women before her. When Vincent returned to the dining room 20 minutes later, he had changed into dark trousers and a white shirt open at the collar. The casual attire should have made him seem more approachable, but instead it had the opposite effect. Without the formal barrier of his business clothes, he looked younger, more vital, and infinitely more dangerous to Lucy's carefully maintained emotional equilibrium. "This looks wonderful," he said as she served the meal. Shepherd's pie with perfectly golden potatoes and vegetables from the Manners overgrown garden that Lucy had managed to salvage and restore to edibility. They ate in silence for several minutes, but it was a different quality of silence than they had shared during their first dinner together. This quiet thrummed with undercurrents, awareness, attraction, and something darker that neither of them was ready to acknowledge. "The Manchester project," Lucy said finally, needing to break the tension before it overwhelmed them both. "You said it was complicated." Vincent looked up from his plate, grateful for the neutral topic. "The residents are more organized than I expected. They've hired lawyers, contacted preservation societies, enlisted the local MP. Usually these things are straightforward. Make an offer, handle the paperwork, begin demolition. But these people—" He trailed off, frowning. "They love their homes," Lucy said quietly. "The way you love this house." The comparison clearly caught Vincent off guard. "I don't love this house. I'm trapped by it. There's a difference." "Is there?" Lucy asked, her dark eyes studying his face with uncomfortable perception. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you're choosing to stay trapped. Choosing to live surrounded by memories instead of making new ones." Vincent's fork clattered against his plate as he set it down with more force than necessary. "You've been here less than a week, Miss Rivers. I hardly think you're qualified to analyze my relationship with my home or my memories." Lucy didn't flinch at his sharp tone. "You're right, of course. I apologize for overstepping." But her voice held no real contrition, and her gaze remained steady on his face. "It's just that I've cared for many people who were grieving, and I've learned to recognize the difference between honoring the dead and being imprisoned by them." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He stared at Lucy across the candle-lit table, seeing not just a beautiful woman, but someone who seemed to understand the deepest corners of his soul. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. "Isabella was pregnant when she died," he said suddenly, the words torn from him without conscious decision. "We've been trying for a child for 2 years. When we finally conceived, I thought it was the beginning of everything I'd ever wanted." Lucy's expression softened with genuine compassion. "I'm so sorry. Losing a wife and child together. I can't imagine the pain." "I found her in the bathtub," Vincent continued, unable to stop the words now that they had started. "The water was cold. She'd been there for hours and His voice broke, and he pressed his hands to his face, as if he could physically hold back the memories. Without thinking, Lucy rose from her chair and went to him, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. The contact should have been comfort, nothing more. But the moment her skin touched his, something electric passed between them. Not just attraction, but recognition, as if their souls were old acquaintances meeting again after a long separation. Vincent looked up at her through his fingers, and Lucy saw raw need in his eyes that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the fundamental human hunger for connection. For a moment, the careful distance between employer and employee dissolved completely, leaving just two lonely people drawn to each other by forces neither of them fully understood. "Vincent," Lucy whispered, his name falling from her lips without the formal address for the first time. He reached up to cover her hand with his own, his fingers trembling slightly. We shouldn't." "No," Lucy agreed, but she didn't pull away. "We shouldn't." They stood frozen in that moment, awareness crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Vincent's thumb traced across Lucy's knuckles, and she found herself leaning closer, drawn by something deeper than conscious desire. Then the lights went out. Not just the dining room lights, but every electrical fixture in Ravenshollow Manor, plunging them into complete darkness, save for the candles on the table. The sudden blackness should have broken the spell between them, Should have sent them scrambling for flashlights and fuse boxes. Instead, it seemed to intensify their connection. In the flickering candlelight, Vincent looked less like the controlled businessman Lucy knew and more like some romantic figure from a Gothic novel. Dangerous, passionate and utterly compelling. The generator must have failed, Vincent said. But his voice was husky, and he made no move to investigate the power failure. Yes, Lucy breathed. Though she suspected the timing was no coincidence, the house itself seemed to be conspiring to push them together, creating circumstances that would strip away their defenses and force them to confront what was growing between them. Vincent's hand tightened on hers, and Lucy felt herself being pulled into something that could destroy them both. But instead of fear, she felt only anticipation. Whatever was happening between them felt inevitable, as if it had been written in the stars long before either of them was born. Lucy, Vincent said again, and this time her name sounded like a prayer on his lips. You should go now before I do something we'll both regret. But Lucy didn't go. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to see the way the candlelight played across the sharp planes of his face. What if I don't want to go? She whispered, the words carrying more courage than she knew she possessed. Vincent's control finally snapped. He surged to his feet, his hands framing her face with desperate intensity. You don't understand what you're asking. What being close to me could cost you? Then tell me, Lucy challenged, her own hands coming up to cover his. Help me understand. For a moment, Vincent looked as though he might confess everything. The family curse, the supernatural forces that had shaped his life, the terrible price that loving him might demand. But instead, he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss, not the careful exploration of new lovers. It was desperate, hungry, full of 3 years of pent-up longing and the knowledge that what they were doing was dangerous beyond measure. Lucy melted into it, her body responding with an intensity that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and the air between them seemed to shimmer with possibility and peril in equal measure. This is madness, Vincent said, but his hands remained on her face, his thumbs stroking across her cheekbones with heartbreaking tenderness. Yes, Lucy agreed, rising on her toes to press her lips to his again. Complete madness. But neither of them pulled away. Instead, they stood wrapped in each other's arms in the candle-lit dining room, while somewhere in the darkness around them, Raven's hollow manor seemed to purr with satisfaction. The game had begun in earnest, and all the pieces were finally in place for a conclusion that had been centuries in the making. Whether that conclusion would bring salvation or damnation remained to be seen. But one thing was certain, Lucy Rivers and Vincent Ashworth had crossed a line from which there would be no return, and the forces that had been waiting in the shadows of the old house were finally ready to claim what they had long considered their due. The power remained off for the rest of the evening, forcing them to navigate by candlelight as Vincent showed Lucy to the basement where the generator was housed. They worked together in the close confines of the utility room, their bodies brushing with electric awareness as they attempted to restore electricity to the manor. Here, Vincent said, his hands covering Lucy's as she struggled with an unfamiliar switch. Let me help. His body pressed against her back as he reached around her, and Lucy could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through the thin fabric of her blouse. The generator roared to life under their combined efforts, but neither of them moved away once the task was completed. Lucy, Vincent murmured against her ear, his breath warm on her neck. We should talk about what's happening between us. She turned in the circle of his arms, her face tilted up to his in the harsh fluorescent light of the basement. What is happening between us? Vincent's expression was tormented, torn between desire and something that looked almost like fear. Something that could destroy us both if we're not careful. And if we are careful? Lucy asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to be careful. The prudent part of her that had survived 24 years of abandonment and uncertainty was screaming warnings, but a deeper, more primitive part of her soul was singing with recognition and want. Then we might survive it, Vincent said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. They made their way back upstairs in silence, the restored lighting somehow making the house feel less magical and more dangerous. The spell of candlelight and darkness had been broken, replaced by the harsh reality of their circumstances, employer and employee, a man haunted by grief and a woman with nothing to offer but her damaged heart. At the top of the servants' stairs, Vincent paused, clearly struggling with himself. "Miss Rivers, Lucy, I want you to know that nothing that happened tonight was your fault. I took advantage of a situation and I—" "No," Lucy interrupted, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "You didn't take advantage of anything. I'm not some helpless child who doesn't understand her own desires." Vincent looked at her with something approaching wonder. "What are your desires?" The question hung between them like a challenge, and Lucy found herself at a crossroads that would determine the rest of her life. She could retreat into the safety of propriety, maintain the boundaries that protected them both from the dangerous attraction that threatened to consume them, or she could step forward into the unknown, accepting whatever consequences might follow. "I want to know you," she said finally, the words barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute truth. "All of you. The parts you show the world and the parts you keep hidden. I want to understand what haunts you and help you find peace with it." "And if knowing me destroys you?" Vincent asked, his voice raw with something that might have been self-loathing. Lucy met his gaze steadily, seeing past his fear to the desperate longing beneath. "Then at least I'll have truly lived before I was destroyed." The answer seemed to break something in Vincent. He reached for her again, pulling her against him with a desperation that bordered on violence. This time when he kissed her, there was nothing gentle or tentative about it. It was possession, claim, and surrender all at once. Lucy responded with equal intensity, her hands fisting in his shirt as she rose to meet his passion with her own. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she heard Isabella's warning about the thin line between salvation and damnation, but she was past the point of caring about consequences. When they broke apart this time, both were shaking, and the air around them seemed to crackle with supernatural energy. The house itself seemed to be responding to their passion, settling and sighing around them like a living thing pleased by their surrender to forces beyond rational control. "This changes everything," Vincent said, his forehead pressed against hers. "Yes," Lucy agreed, though she wasn't entirely sure what this was or how it would change their lives. "Everything." They separated reluctantly, the practical necessity of maintaining some semblance of propriety warring with the magnetic pull that seemed to draw them together. But as Lucy retreated to her small room and Vincent climbed the stairs to his solitary bedroom, both carried with them the knowledge that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. In her narrow bed, Lucy lay awake listening to the sounds of the old house settling around them. But tonight the creaks and sighs sounded different, not mournful or threatening, but expectant. As if Ravenshollow Manor itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next in the ancient drama that was finally approaching its climax. Miles above her, Vincent stood at his bedroom window, staring out at the moonlit moors, his reflection ghosted in the glass like a spectre. For the first time in 3 years, he felt truly alive, truly connected to another human being. But he also felt the weight of his family's dark legacy pressing down on him like a physical presence. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to pursue what was growing between him and Lucy, or to send her away before the forces that had claimed Isabella could claim her as well. It was a choice that would determine not just their fates, but the fate of every generation of Ashworths to come. And in the space between sleeping and waking, as both Vincent and Lucy finally drifted toward dreams, the ghost of Isabella Ashworth smiled in the darkness, knowing that the final act of her long-planned redemption was about to begin. Dawn broke grey and reluctant over the Yorkshire moors, seeping through the ancient windows of Ravenshollow Manor, like watercolour bleeding through paper. Lucy woke with Vincent's name on her lips, and the taste of their forbidden kiss still burning her mouth. The rational part of her mind insisted that what had happened between them was madness, a moment of weakness brought on by candlelight, wine, and the intoxicating atmosphere of the old house. But her body told a different story, humming with awareness and a restless energy that made lying still impossible. She rose before the sun fully cleared the horizon, needing the familiar comfort of work to steady her trembling hands and racing thoughts. The kitchen felt different in the early morning light, less like a servant's domain, and more like the heart of a home where she truly belonged. As she prepared Vincent's breakfast, Lucy found herself imagining a future where such mornings were commonplace, where she had the right to wake beside him rather than rise alone to serve him. It was a dangerous fantasy, one that ignored the vast chasm between their social positions and the supernatural forces that seemed determined to destroy any woman who dared to love an Ashworth man. But as Lucy arranged fresh flowers in a vase, roses she had found blooming impossibly late in the season in the manor's overgrown gardens, she couldn't bring herself to care about practicalities. Vincent appeared in the doorway just as she was setting the table, and the sight of him made her breath catch. He had clearly slept as poorly as she had, his dark hair disheveled and shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of a night spent wrestling with demons both internal and supernatural. But there was something else in his expression, a softness she had never seen before, as if their kiss had cracked open something in him that had been sealed away for too long. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep and something deeper. "Good morning, sir," Lucy replied, then immediately regretted the formal address. After what had passed between them, sir seemed ridiculous. Vincent caught the hesitation and moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with something uniquely masculine that made her pulse quicken. "I think we're past sir now, don't you?" Lucy felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. Vincent, then. Her name on his lips the night before had sounded like a prayer, but his name in her mouth felt like a claiming, dangerous and thrilling in equal measure. Vincent's eyes darkened at the sound, and for a moment Lucy thought he might reach for her again, might pull her into his arms and continue what they had started in the candlelit dining room. Instead, he moved to his usual place at the table, though his movements were stiff with the effort of restraint. "We need to talk about what happened." Lucy poured his coffee, noting how his hands shook slightly as he accepted the cup. "Do we? Or should we pretend it was an aberration brought on by darkness and wine?" Vincent's laugh was bitter. If only it were that simple. He studied her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as if he could see straight through to her soul. "Tell me honestly, Lucy, have you experienced anything unusual since you've been at Ravenshollow? Dreams, voices, sensations you can't explain?" The question caught Lucy off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it revealed how much Vincent suspected about the supernatural forces at work in his home. She could lie, maintain the pretense that she was simply an ordinary woman who had stumbled into extraordinary circumstances, but looking into his tormented eyes, she realized they were past the point where lies could protect either of them. "I dream of your wife," she said quietly, watching his face carefully for his reaction. "Isabella. She speaks to me about the family curse, about the women who have died loving Ashworth men. She warned me that the same fate might await me if I'm not careful." Vincent's coffee cup hit the table with a sharp crack, dark liquid splashing across the white cloth. "She warned you?" "Lucy, Isabella is dead. She's been dead for 3 years. "I know that," Lucy said, surprised by how calm she sounded. "But death doesn't always silence those who have important things to say. She's been waiting for someone like me, someone who could see and hear her clearly enough to understand the truth about what happened to her." Vincent pushed back from the table abruptly, pacing to the window where weak morning light struggled through diamond-paned glass. "There is no curse. There are no ghosts. There's just an old house and the kind of tragic accidents that happen when people let superstition override common sense." But even as he spoke the words, Vincent's voice lacked conviction. Lucy rose and followed him to the window, standing close enough to feel the tension radiating from his rigid frame. "Then explain the dreams that started the night before I even applied for this position," she said softly. "Explain why I feel like I've been in this house before, why every room seems familiar, even though I'd never set foot in Yorkshire until a week ago. Explain why the roses in your garden are blooming in October, when they should have finished months ago." Vincent's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Coincidences, imagination, the power of suggestion working on a mind predisposed to believe in the supernatural. Lucy reached out to touch his arm, and the moment her fingers made contact with his sleeve, the temperature in the room dropped by at least 10 degrees. Their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started forming on the windows, despite the fact that it was a relatively mild autumn morning. "Coincidence?" Lucy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent stared at the frost spreading across the glass like delicate lace, his rational mind struggling to find an explanation for what he was witnessing. But deep in his soul he knew Lucy was right. The supernatural forces that had shaped his family's history for generations were stirring again, drawn by the connection growing between him and this remarkable woman who saw truth where others saw only shadows. "My grandmother used to tell stories," he admitted finally, his voice hollow with reluctant acceptance, about the first Vincent Ashworth, who made his fortune through a bargain with something that shouldn't exist in the rational world. Every generation since has prospered beyond reason, but always at a cost. The women we love, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. They die, Lucy completed softly, violently, tragically, always when they're carrying the next generation. The guardian spirit demands payment for continued prosperity, and that payment is always made in blood. Vincent turned to face her, his expression wild with something between desperation and hope. "If you know all this, if Isabella has told you what happens to the women who love Ashworth men, then why are you still here? Why didn't you run when you realized what you were walking into?" Lucy met his gaze unflinchingly, seeing the fear and self-loathing he tried so hard to hide. "Because Isabella also told me there might be a way to break the pattern. And because—" she hesitated, then decided that honesty was the only path forward now that they had come so far. "Because I've been alone my entire life, and I'd rather risk dying loved than live forever unwanted." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow, and he reached for her without thinking, his hands framing her face with desperate tenderness. "You're not unwanted. God help me, Lucy. I want you more than I've ever wanted anything in my life. But I can't bear the thought of destroying you the way I destroyed Isabella." "You didn't destroy Isabella," Lucy said fiercely, covering his hands with her own. "The curse did. Your ancestors' bargain did. But we don't have to let it destroy us. There has to be a way to break free from the past, to choose a different future." Vincent's thumb traced across her cheekbone, and Lucy felt herself melting into his touch, despite the supernatural cold that still gripped the room. What if there isn't? What if loving me is a death sentence that no amount of hope or determination can overturn? "Then we fight," Lucy said simply. "We fight the curse, we fight the guardian spirit, we fight fate itself if we have to. But we don't surrender without trying." Vincent stared at her for a long moment, seeing not just beauty but courage that shamed his own cowardice. For 3 years he had hidden from the truth of his family's legacy, choosing isolation over the risk of causing more pain. But Lucy was offering him something he had never dared to hope for, the possibility of love without destruction, of breaking cycles that had seemed unbreakable. "You could die," he said, needing her to understand the full magnitude of what she was proposing. "I could live," she countered, rising on her toes to brush her lips against his. "We could both live, really truly live, instead of just existing in the shadows of the dead." The kiss that followed was different from their desperate embrace the night before. This was slower, deeper, full of promise and possibility rather than mere hunger. As their mouths moved together, the supernatural cold began to recede, replaced by a warmth that seemed to emanate from their joined bodies and spread outward to fill the entire room. When they finally broke apart, the frost had melted from the windows, and normal October sunlight was streaming through the glass. But the change in atmosphere went deeper than temperature. Something fundamental had shifted in Ravenshollow Manor, as if the house itself was responding to their decision to fight rather than surrender. "Where do we begin?" Vincent asked, and Lucy heard in his voice the first stirrings of hope he had allowed himself since Isabella's death. "With the truth," Lucy said. "All of it. I need to know everything about your family's history. Every detail Isabella might not have had time to share. And you need to meet with the guardian spirit directly to understand exactly what we're fighting against." Vincent's face went pale. "Lucy, no. The guardian doesn't communicate directly with the living, except during the ritual sacrifices. Attempting contact outside of those circumstances could be dangerous," Lucy finished, "but we can't fight an enemy we don't understand." Isabella spent 3 years on the other side, studying the curse's mechanisms. She must have learned something that could help us. Before Vincent could respond, they were interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze, footsteps on the floor above, moving with the measured pace of someone exploring familiar territory. But the upper floors were sealed, had been sealed since Isabella's death, and no living person should have been able to access them. Vincent's face hardened with grim determination. "Stay here." "Absolutely not," Lucy said, matching his resolve with her own. "We're in this together now, remember? Besides, if it's Isabella, she's more likely to speak openly with me present." They climbed the main staircase together, Vincent's hand resting protectively on Lucy's lower back as they ascended toward the sounds. The rope barrier that had been carefully maintained for 3 years lay on the floor, cut clean through as if by an invisible blade. The dust sheets that had covered everything were now neatly folded and stacked against the walls, revealing the preserved grandeur of rooms that had been frozen in time. The footsteps led them to Isabella's art studio, a room at the far end of the hall that Lucy had not yet explored. The door stood open, revealing a space filled with easels, canvases, and the lingering scent of oil paints and turpentine. Isabella stood before a half-finished landscape, her ghostly form more solid and present than Lucy had ever seen her. "Vincent," Isabella said without turning around, her voice carrying across the years like an echo of old love. "I was wondering when you would finally bring her to see me properly." Vincent's breath caught in his throat, and Lucy felt him sway beside her as he confronted the apparition of his dead wife. "Isabella? But you're dead, yes. I'm quite aware of that fact, darling." Isabella turned to face them, and Lucy was struck by how beautiful she looked even in death, luminous and ethereal, but somehow more real than many living people. But death has its advantages when it comes to understanding the true nature of the forces we're dealing with. "The curse," Lucy said, stepping forward slightly. "You said there might be a way to break it." Isabella nodded, her dark eyes moving between Lucy and Vincent, with an expression that was both sad and hopeful. "The guardian spirit feeds on sacrifice, on the pain and loss of the Ashworth line. But its power isn't absolute. It's bound by the terms of the original bargain, constrained by rules that haven't been tested, because no one has ever been brave enough to challenge them." "What kind of rules?" Vincent asked, his voice rough with the effort of speaking to his dead wife, while the woman he was falling in love with stood beside him. "The sacrifice must be willing," Isabella explained. "The woman must choose her fate, must walk into death with full knowledge of what awaits her." "But Lucy—" She turned her full attention to the younger woman, and Lucy felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her. What if the choice weren't between sacrifice and abandonment? What if there were a third option, one that required different kinds of courage but offered the possibility of true freedom? Lucy's heart began to race as she sensed they were approaching the crux of everything. "What are you suggesting?" Isabella's smile was both beautiful and terrible, full of the wisdom that could only come from standing on the threshold between worlds. "The guardian spirit has grown fat and lazy on easy victories, on women who had no choice but to submit to their fate. But you're different, Lucy. You've always been different. You have abilities the others lacked, the gift of sight, of communication across the veil. You could challenge the guardian directly, force it to play by rules it has forgotten exist." "That sounds incredibly dangerous," Vincent said, moving protectively closer to Lucy. "What if you're wrong? What if challenging the guardian only makes it more determined to claim her? Then she dies fighting instead of dies submitting," Isabella replied with stark honesty. "But Vincent, my love, she's going to die anyway if nothing changes. The moment she chose to love you, her fate was sealed according to the old patterns. This way, at least, there's a chance for something different." Lucy felt the truth of those words settle into her bones like winter cold. She had known from the moment she entered Ravenshollow Manor that she was walking toward her destiny, whatever form it might take. The only question was whether that destiny would be chosen or imposed. "How?" she asked simply. Isabella gestured toward the half-finished landscape on the easel behind her. "I was painting this when I died. A view of the stone circle on the moor where the first Vincent made his bargain with the guardian. The circle is still there, still active during certain celestial alignments. The next alignment occurs on Samhain, Halloween night, when the veil between worlds is thinnest. That's only 3 weeks away," Vincent said, his voice tight with anxiety. "Time enough to prepare," Isabella said. "But Lucy, you must understand what you would be facing. The guardian spirit isn't human, isn't bound by human morality or compassion. It's ancient, powerful, and utterly ruthless in protecting what it considers its due. Challenging it directly could result in a fate worse than simple death." Lucy looked at Vincent, seeing her own fear reflected in his dark eyes along with something else, a fierce protective love that was worth any risk. "What would I need to do?" "Learn to use your gifts fully," Isabella replied. "The ability to see and speak with the dead is only the beginning of what you're capable of. During the 3 weeks remaining, I can teach you to walk between worlds, to command supernatural forces, to become something more than human if necessary." "And if I succeed in this challenge?" Lucy asked, though part of her was afraid to hope for too much. Isabella's expression softened with genuine warmth. "If you succeed, the curse ends forever. The guardian spirit's hold on the Ashworth line is broken, and you and Vincent are free to love without consequence. Your children, should you choose to have them, will be born without the shadow of their ancestors' bargain hanging over them." Vincent reached for Lucy's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a grip that spoke of desperation and determination in equal measure. "Lucy, I can't ask you to take this risk. The price of failure." "The price of not trying is just as high," Lucy interrupted, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Isabella's right. I'm going to die anyway if we don't change things. At least this way I die fighting for something beautiful, instead of simply being consumed by something evil." Vincent's hand tightened on hers, and Lucy could see him wrestling with his own protective instincts. Every fiber of his being wanted to lock her away somewhere safe, to send her far from Ravenshollow Manor and the supernatural forces that threatened her. But he also understood that running would only postpone the inevitable. The guardian spirit had claimed her the moment she set foot in the house, and distance wouldn't protect her from a fate that had been written in starlight and blood. 3 weeks, he said finally, and Lucy heard acceptance in his voice, along with a fear that made her heart ache for him. "What do we do?" Isabella's ghostly form began to fade slightly, as if the effort of manifesting so solidly was becoming too much for her. "We prepare for war," she said simply, "and we pray that love is stronger than the darkness that has fed on our family for centuries." As Isabella's image dissolved into morning sunlight, Lucy felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a mantle. 3 weeks to learn to wield powers she had never fully understood. 3 weeks to prepare for a confrontation that would determine not just her fate, but the fate of every future generation of Ashworth men and the women who dared to love them. But as she looked into Vincent's eyes and saw her own determination reflected there, Lucy felt something she had never experienced before. Not hope, exactly, but something deeper and more powerful. She felt the absolute certainty that whatever the next 3 weeks might bring, she would face it with courage and the knowledge that she was finally exactly where she belonged. The real battle for their future was about to begin, and Lucy Rivers had never been more ready for a fight in her life. Love had brought her to Ravenshollow Manor, but it would be courage that determined whether she left it alive. Vincent's arms came around her then, holding her with a desperation that spoke of years of loneliness and loss, and Lucy let herself be held, drawing strength from his warmth and the steady beat of his heart against her chest. Whatever supernatural forces awaited them in the ancient stone circle, whatever powers she would need to master in the weeks ahead, she would face them all gladly for the chance to build a life with this broken, beautiful man who had awakened her heart from its long sleep. In the distance, thunder rolled across the Yorkshire moors, despite the clear morning sky, and Lucy knew that the guardian spirit had heard Isabella's words and was already preparing its own response to their challenge. The game was afoot, and the stakes could not have been higher. But for the first time since childhood, Lucy Rivers felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she had been born to do, and that knowledge gave her a strength she had never imagined possible. The next 3 weeks would test them both beyond anything they had ever endured, but they would face those tests together. And sometimes, Lucy thought, as Vincent's lips found hers in a kiss that tasted of promise and defiance, together was enough to overcome even the darkest magic. As they embraced in Isabella's abandoned studio, surrounded by the ghost of love past and the hope of love future, the ancient house settled around them with what sounded almost like approval. Even Ravenshollow Manor, it seemed, was ready for the old patterns to be broken and new stories to be written in its shadow-haunted halls. The battle for their souls was about to begin, and Lucy had never felt more alive. Vincent held her tighter, as if he could shield her from the supernatural storm that was gathering around them. With nothing but the strength of his arms and the fierce protectiveness in his heart. And for a moment, surrounded by love and determination and the lingering presence of those who had gone before, it almost felt like it might be enough. But the guardian spirit was ancient and cunning, and it had never lost a battle for the soul of an Ashworth bride. The real test was yet to come, and Lucy could only pray that when it did, she would prove stronger than all the women who had come before her, strong enough to break chains forged in darkness and write a new destiny in light. The stone circle awaited, and with it, the answer to everything they had dared to hope and dream. 3 weeks to prepare for the confrontation that would determine whether love truly could conquer all, or whether some darkness was too ancient and too powerful to ever be overcome. Lucy looked into Vincent's eyes and saw her own resolve reflected there, and knew that whatever the outcome, they would face it as they had chosen to face everything else, together, unafraid, and utterly committed to the belief that some things were worth fighting for, even unto death. The real story was only just beginning. The training began that very afternoon. In the hours when autumn light slanted golden through Isabella's studio windows, and the boundary between worlds grew thin enough for the dead to teach the living. Lucy had expected something mystical, perhaps involving arcane symbols or ancient incantations. Instead, Isabella's first lesson was far more practical and infinitely more disturbing. "Show me your hands," the ghost instructed, her form flickering between solid and translucent as she fought to maintain her presence in the physical realm. Lucy extended her palms upward, noting how they trembled slightly, despite her determination to appear brave. Isabella's ethereal fingers traced the lines there, and where she touched, Lucy felt a sensation like ice water flowing through her veins. "Good," Isabella murmured, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You have the marks of one who walks between worlds, the lifeline broken and rejoined, the heart line that splits in 2 directions. You were born for this battle, Lucy, even if you didn't know it." Vincent stood in the doorway, his face a mask of controlled anguish as he watched his dead wife prepare his living lover for a confrontation that could destroy them all. The surreal nature of the situation would have been laughable if the stakes weren't so devastatingly high. "The first thing you must understand," Isabella continued, her dark eyes fixed intently on Lucy's face, "is that the guardian spirit feeds on fear, doubt, and desperation. It has grown strong over the centuries by consuming the terror of women who face death with no hope of victory. But you won't be going into this battle afraid, will you?" Lucy met the ghost's gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "No, I'm going in to win." Isabella's smile was radiant, transforming her ethereal features with an inner light that made her seem more alive than many breathing people. "That's the first key to victory, absolute certainty in your own power. The guardian spirit can sense doubt like a bloodhound scents prey. Any wavering in your resolve will give it the opening it needs to destroy you." Over the following days, Isabella's lessons grew more complex and more dangerous. Lucy learned to project her consciousness beyond her physical form, to see the streams of supernatural energy that flowed through Ravenshollow Manor like arteries carrying lifeblood. She discovered that her sensitivity to the emotions of places and people was only the surface of abilities that ran far deeper than she had ever imagined. "You're not just psychically gifted," Isabella explained during one particularly intense session. "You're what my grandmother would have called a bridge walker, someone capable of moving freely between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. It's an incredibly rare ability, and it's exactly what you'll need to confront the Guardian on its own territory." The training was exhausting, leaving Lucy drained and disoriented as she pushed the boundaries of what her mortal mind could comprehend. But it was also exhilarating in ways she had never expected. For the first time in her life, Lucy felt truly powerful, truly in control of forces that had always controlled her. Vincent watched her transformation with a mixture of pride and terror. Each day Lucy grew more ethereal, more otherworldly, as if preparing for battle with supernatural forces was pulling her away from the purely human realm he inhabited. He began to fear that even if she survived the confrontation with the guardian spirit, she might be so changed by the experience that the woman he loved would be lost forever. "She's becoming something else," he confided to Isabella one evening, when Lucy had exhausted herself practicing astral projection and was resting in their old bedroom. Something beyond human. Isabella's ghostly form solidified slightly as she turned her attention to her husband's torment. "She's becoming what she was always meant to be," she corrected gently. "The question is whether you'll be able to love her as she truly is, not just as you imagined her to be." The words stung because they contained more truth than Vincent was comfortable acknowledging. Part of him had been drawn to Lucy's quiet, damaged humanity, the way she needed care and protection, the way she looked at him with gratitude for simple kindnesses. But as her power grew, so did her independence, and Vincent found himself struggling with the realization that the woman he loved might not need him at all once this was over. "I've never been loved for my strength before," he admitted, the confession torn from him by the peculiar intimacy of speaking to his dead wife about his living lover. "Isabella, you loved me despite my darkness, in spite of what my family's legacy might cost you. But Lucy seems to love me because of it, not in spite of it. She's strong enough to stand beside me rather than behind me, and I don't know if I'm brave enough for that kind of equality." Isabella's expression softened with something that might have been pity or might have been understanding. "Vincent, my darling, you've spent so long thinking of yourself as a destroyer that you've forgotten you might also be capable of creating something beautiful. Lucy doesn't want you to protect her from your darkness. She wants to share it with you, to transform it into something that serves love rather than fear." Before Vincent could respond, the conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both of them freeze, Lucy screaming in anguish from the bedroom above. Vincent took the stairs 3 at a time, Isabella's ghostly form flowing beside him like smoke, and burst into the room to find Lucy thrashing on the bed, her body rigid with supernatural convulsions. "It's fighting back," Isabella said grimly, moving to place her ethereal hands on Lucy's forehead. "The guardian spirit has realized what we're planning, and it's trying to break her mind before she becomes strong enough to challenge it directly." Vincent felt helpless as he watched the 2 women, one dead, one living, both fighting for their very souls. Battle forces he could neither see nor understand. Lucy's eyes had rolled back until only the whites showed, and when she spoke, her voice was not her own. "She belongs to me," the alien voice hissed through Lucy's lips, the words dripping with malevolent possessiveness. "Every woman who loves an Ashworth man belongs to me, and I will not be denied what is mine by right and contract." "You have no contract with her," Isabella shot back, her ghostly form blazing with protective fury. "Lucy Rivers was never part of your bargain. She chooses her own fate." The thing speaking through Lucy laughed, a sound like breaking glass and dying animals. "Choice is an illusion for mortals. She entered my domain. She loves my property. She carries the mark of sacrifice. She is mine, and I will consume her as I have consumed all the others." Vincent could bear it no longer. He threw himself onto the bed beside Lucy, gathering her convulsing form into his arms, despite the supernatural cold that radiated from her skin. "Lucy, come back to me. Don't let it take you. Fight!" For a moment, the alien presence seemed to strengthen, and Lucy's body went completely rigid in Vincent's arms. Then her eyes snapped open, blazing with an inner light that was purely her own, and when she spoke, her voice carried a power that shook the very foundations of Raven's Hollow Manor. "I am not your property," she declared, each word resonating with supernatural authority. "I am not a sacrifice or a possession or a prize to be claimed. I am Lucy Rivers, Bridgewalker and Guardian of the Threshold, and I reject your claim on my soul." The temperature in the room plummeted so quickly that frost formed on the windows in spiral patterns that looked like screaming faces. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the supernatural assault ended, leaving Lucy gasping and shaking in Vincent's arms, while Isabella's form flickered with the exhaustion of maintaining her presence during such intense spiritual combat. "That was a warning," Isabella said when she could speak again. "It knows we're preparing for direct confrontation, and it will do everything in its power to stop us before Samhain arrives." Lucy struggled to sit up, her face pale but her eyes bright with determination. "Let it try. Every attack only proves how afraid it is of facing me on equal terms." Vincent helped her to her feet, noting how she swayed slightly but refused to lean on him for support. The woman he had fallen in love with had been gentle and dependent in many ways, but the woman she was becoming was fierce and self-possessed. Both versions had their appeal, but he was beginning to understand that Lucy's true strength had always been there, hidden beneath years of conditioning that told her to make herself small and unassuming. "Tell me about the original contract," Lucy said to Isabella, settling into a chair by the window where afternoon light painted golden patterns on her skin. "I need to understand exactly what the first Vincent agreed to and how the guardian spirit has been interpreting those terms." Isabella's form solidified as she prepared to share knowledge that had been hidden for centuries. It happened in 1847, during the potato famine, when so many English families were struggling to maintain their estates. Vincent Ashworth was facing bankruptcy. The family had made poor investments. The land was failing to produce adequate crops, and creditors were circling like vultures. As Isabella spoke, the room around them seemed to shift and blur, as if they were looking back through time to witness events that had shaped the destiny of every generation since. Lucy felt herself being pulled into the narrative, experiencing it not just as a story, but as a living memory. "Vincent was desperate," Isabella continued, her voice taking on the cadence of ancient storytelling. He had heard whispers from older families about bargains that could be made with entities that existed beyond the normal world. The stone circle on the moors had always been considered a place of power, avoided by the local villagers who left offerings there during certain seasons, but never lingered after dark. The ghostly images grew clearer, and Lucy could see a younger version of Vincent's face, the same sharp features and dark eyes, but twisted with desperation and barely contained panic. He stood in the center of a circle of ancient stones, their surfaces carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "He went there on the night of Samhain, when the veil between worlds is thinnest," Isabella said, "and he called upon whatever forces might be listening, offering to pay any price for the prosperity of his bloodline." Lucy watched in fascination and horror as something answered that long-ago call. The guardian spirit didn't have a fixed form. Sometimes it appeared as a beautiful woman, sometimes as a creature made of shadow and starlight, sometimes as nothing more than a voice that seemed to come from the stones themselves. "The terms seem simple enough," Isabella continued. "Prosperity for the Ashworth line, wealth beyond imagining, success in every venture. In exchange, every generation would offer a bride to the guardian, a woman who loved an Ashworth man completely, who would die at the moment of her greatest happiness to feed the entity's hunger for mortal emotion." "But why pregnancy?" Lucy asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because that's when a woman's life force is strongest," Isabella replied with grim understanding. "When she's creating new life, when she's filled with hope and love and plans for the future. The guardian feeds on that intensity of feeling, grows stronger from the contrast between ultimate joy and ultimate despair." Vincent's face was white with self-loathing as he listened to the details of his family's original sin. "Every woman who has died loving an Ashworth man has been murdered by my ancestors' greed. Every child lost, every future destroyed. It's all built on a foundation of supernatural betrayal." "Yes," Isabella said simply. "But Vincent, darling, you're not responsible for the choices your ancestor made. You can only choose how to respond to the legacy you've inherited." Lucy rose from her chair and moved to Vincent's side, taking his hands in hers, despite the supernatural cold that still lingered from her recent possession. "The guardian spirit interprets the contract broadly, because no one has ever challenged those interpretations. It assumes that any woman who loves an Ashworth man automatically becomes subject to the bargain. But what if that assumption is wrong?" "What do you mean?" Vincent asked, hope and fear warring in his expression. "What if the contract only applies to women who enter the bargain willingly, with full knowledge of its terms?" Lucy said, her mind racing with possibilities. "The first Vincent offered himself and his bloodline, but he couldn't make agreements on behalf of people who hadn't even been born yet. The guardian has been taking what it wanted rather than what it was actually promised." Isabella's eyes widened with sudden understanding. "Of course. Lucy, you're brilliant. The entity has been operating under the assumption that its power was absolute, but magical contracts are bound by their original wording. If we can prove that you never agreed to be part of the bargain, then challenging it becomes a matter of justice rather than rebellion," Lucy finished. "I'm not breaking a lawful contract. I'm demanding that an unlawful claim be recognized as void." The implications sent excitement coursing through all three of them. For the first time since learning about the curse, they had found what might be a legal loophole in supernatural law. But even as hope began to bloom, Isabella's expression grew troubled. "There's still the matter of the confrontation itself," she warned. "Even if your challenge is legally sound, the Guardian won't simply accept defeat. It's been feeding on Ashworth women for over a century and 70 years. That's a lot of accumulated power, and it won't give up its source of sustenance without a fight." Over the next 2 weeks, Lucy's training intensified as Halloween approached with inevitable momentum. She learned to manipulate supernatural energy, to project her will across the boundaries between worlds, to stand firm in the face of entities that could drive mortal minds to madness with their very presence. But perhaps most importantly, she learned to access the power that came from being completely, utterly certain of her own worth and agency. Vincent watched her grow stronger with each passing day and found himself falling more deeply in love, even as he struggled with his own fears of inadequacy. The woman Lucy was becoming didn't need his protection or his rescue. She needed his partnership, his equal commitment to building something beautiful from the wreckage of the past. It was a more demanding kind of love than he had ever experienced, but also a more rewarding one. Their physical relationship deepened as well, taking on an urgency born of their uncertain future. They made love with desperate passion in front of the fireplace in Vincent's study, on the kitchen table where Lucy had served him breakfast that first morning, in Isabella's art studio, while her ghost looked on with benevolent approval. Each encounter was colored by the knowledge that it might be their last, but also by a growing confidence that they were building something strong enough to survive even supernatural assault. "I love you," Vincent whispered against Lucy's neck as they lay entwined in his bed 3 nights before Halloween, her body warm and pliant in his arms. "Not just your courage or your strength or your gifts. I love your stubbornness and your independence, and the way you look at me like I'm worth saving." Lucy turned in his arms, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight as she studied his face. "I love you too. Your darkness and your light, your guilt and your hope. The way you're brave enough to let me fight my own battles while still being there to catch me if I fall." They held each other through the night, drawing strength from their connection, as the final preparations for their confrontation with forces older than human civilization continued around them. Isabella worked tirelessly to gather information about the Guardian Spirit's vulnerabilities, while Lucy practiced the mental exercises that would allow her to maintain her identity and purpose, even when faced with cosmic horror. The morning of October 31st dawned grey and cold, with a wind that carried the scent of dying leaves and something else, something that smelled like ozone and ancient stone and the space between heartbeats. Lucy woke in Vincent's arms feeling more alive and more powerful than she ever had, as if every moment of her life had been leading to this day. "Are you ready?" Vincent asked, though he knew the question was more about his own fears than her preparation. Lucy smiled, the expression radiant with confidence and love, and the kind of fierce joy that could light up the darkest night. "I was born ready for this." We both were. As evening approached and the veil between worlds grew thin, they made their final preparations. Lucy dressed in white, not as a bride going to sacrifice, but as a warrior claiming her right to determine her own fate. Vincent donned black, standing as witness and support, but understanding that this battle was ultimately hers to fight. Isabella's ghostly form was stronger than it had ever been, fed by the supernatural energies swirling around All Hallows' Eve, and by the determination of the living couple she had grown to love. "Remember," she told Lucy as they prepared to leave for the stone circle, "the Guardian's power comes from the fear and submission of its victims. Stand firm in your own truth, and it cannot touch your soul." They drove to the moors in Vincent's Range Rover, the headlights cutting through darkness that seemed deeper and more oppressive than any ordinary night. Lucy sat beside him, her hand resting on his thigh, drawing comfort from his presence while maintaining the mental barriers Isabella had taught her to construct. The stone circle was older than Christianity, older than the Romans, older than any human memory. The ancient stones stood like sentinels against the star-scattered sky, their surfaces carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the moonlight. As Lucy stepped into the center of the circle, she felt the weight of centuries pressing down on her, all the women who had died in this place, all the lives sacrificed to feed an entity's hunger for mortal emotion. But she also felt something else, the presence of those same women, their spirits drawn to witness what might finally be their vindication. They couldn't interfere directly, but their collective will surrounded Lucy like armor, lending her strength for the battle ahead. The guardian spirit answered her call immediately, manifesting as a pillar of shadow and starlight that towered above the ancient stones. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of worlds ending and being reborn. "You have come to fulfill the contract," it said, and Lucy felt the weight of its attention like a physical presence. "You have come to feed me your life and your love, as all the others have done." "No," Lucy replied, her voice steady despite the cosmic power arrayed against her. "I've come to tell you that your contract with the Ashworth line is void. You have no claim on me, and you never did." The Guardian's laughter was like the sound of breaking stars. "I have fed on Ashworth brides for nearly 2 centuries. Their fear, their despair, their dying love, all of it has been mine by right." "By theft," Lucy corrected, and now her voice carried the authority she had been learning to wield. The original Vincent Ashworth offered his own bloodline, but he had no power to bind the women who would choose to love his descendants. "We were never part of the bargain, and your century of feeding has been nothing but elaborate murder." The Guardian's form shifted and writhed, and Lucy felt the full force of its rage pressing against her mental shields. "You dare challenge me? You dare question contracts written in blood and starlight?" "I dare," Lucy said, and stepped forward into the heart of its power. "I am Lucy Rivers, Bridgewalker and Guardian of the Threshold, and I claim my right to choose my own fate. Release your hold on the Ashworth line, or face me in battle for the right to continue your predation." The ancient entity considered her challenge, and Lucy felt herself being evaluated by a consciousness older than human civilization. Then it smiled, an expression of infinite malevolence that made the temperature plummet and the stones around them begin to weep tears of ice. "Very well," it said, and Lucy knew that the real battle was about to begin. "Face me then, little Bridgewalker, and learn what it means to challenge forces beyond your comprehension. Winner claims not just your soul, but the souls of every Ashworth woman who has ever lived." Lucy smiled back, fierce and bright and utterly unafraid. "Winner takes all," she agreed. "Let's dance." The final confrontation was about to begin, and Lucy Rivers had never felt more ready to fight for love, for life, and for the right to write her own destiny in defiance of cosmic forces that had held sway for far too long. The battle for their souls would be decided by dawn, and Lucy intended to greet the sunrise as a free woman in the arms of the man she loved. The guardian spirit's form exploded outward like a dark star going supernova, filling the ancient stone circle with writhing shadows that seemed to contain the screams of every woman who had ever died loving an Ashworth man. Lucy felt the assault hit her mental defenses like a tsunami of pure malevolence, testing every barrier Isabella had taught her to construct over the past 3 weeks, but she held firm. The entity's first attack was psychological, a flood of images designed to break her will by showing her exactly what fate awaited those who dared to challenge its authority. Lucy saw Isabella drowning in that ornate bathtub, her pregnant belly grotesquely swollen as supernatural forces pulled her under. She saw Vincent's grandmother, throat slit from ear to ear as she screamed her husband's name. She witnessed a dozen other Ashworth brides meeting violent ends, their love twisted into weapons against them by a creature that fed on the perversion of beautiful emotions. "Do you see?" The Guardian hissed, its voice now coming from everywhere at once, the stones, the wind, the very earth beneath their feet. "This is what becomes of women who love Ashworth men. This is your destiny, written in blood and starlight long before you were born." Lucy stood in the center of the maelstrom, her white dress whipping around her in the supernatural wind, and felt something shift inside her soul. Instead of terror, she experienced a profound rage, not just at the entity's cruelty, but at the waste of it all. How many brilliant women had been cut down in their prime? How many children had never been born? How many love stories had been murdered before they could write their own endings? "No," she said, and her voice carried across the moors with the authority of thunder. "This is what becomes of women who had no choice, who were never taught they could fight back. But I am not them, and I will not die for your entertainment." The Guardian's laughter was like the sound of civilizations crumbling. Bold words from one who understands so little. "You think your weeks of training have prepared you to face powers that predate your species? You are nothing but a mortal insect, and I will crush you as easily as all the others." But when the entity struck with its full supernatural might, something unexpected happened. Lucy didn't just deflect the attack, she absorbed it, using techniques Isabella had shown her in the final days of training. The Guardian's malevolent energy flowed into her like dark lightning, and instead of destroying her, it made her stronger. "Impossible," the creature snarled, its form wavering for the first time since the confrontation began. "No mortal can contain that much spiritual force without being consumed." Lucy smiled, and the expression was terrible in its beauty, not the gentle, damaged woman Vincent had first met, but something far more dangerous and magnificent. "I'm not just mortal anymore. I'm a bridge-walker, a guardian of thresholds, a daughter of two worlds, and you've been feeding me your own power with every attack." Vincent watched from the edge of the stone circle, his heart hammering against his ribs as he witnessed the woman he loved transform into something that belonged more to legend than to the ordinary world. She was still Lucy, still the person whose gentle hands had served him breakfast, and whose soft voice had comforted him through his grief. But she was also something else now, something that blazed with inner fire and commanded respect, from forces that had ruled the darkness since before humanity learned to fear the night. The Guardian spirit seemed to sense the shift in dynamics, because its next attack was more vicious and personal. Instead of trying to overwhelm Lucy with raw power, it reached into Vincent's mind, using their connection against her. Suddenly, Lucy could see through Vincent's eyes, feel his terror, as supernatural forces he couldn't comprehend raged around the woman he loved. She experienced his desperate urge to run into the circle and protect her, held back only by Isabella's ghostly hand on his arm, and the knowledge that his interference could destroy everything they had worked for. "He loves you," the Guardian whispered, its voice now honey-sweet and poisonous. "Can you feel how much he loves you? How terrified he is of losing you? That love, that fear, it's delicious. It will make his suffering all the more exquisite when I tear you apart in front of his eyes." Lucy felt Vincent's anguish like a physical wound, and for a moment her concentration wavered. The Guardian sensed the weakness immediately, pressing its advantage with renewed fury. Dark tendrils of energy wrapped around Lucy's limbs, trying to pull her down into the earth where ancient bones lay buried beneath the stone circle. "Yes," the entity hissed, as Lucy struggled against bonds forged from nightmare and despair. "Feel his helplessness. Feel how inadequate his mortal love is against my eternal hunger. You could end his suffering now. Submit to me willingly, and I will make his death quick and clean. Fight me, and I will keep him alive for centuries, feeding on his grief and guilt while his sanity slowly crumbles." The threat against Vincent ignited something primal in Lucy's soul. She had come to this confrontation prepared to sacrifice herself if necessary to break the curse, but she would not allow the creature to touch the man she loved. With a sound that was part scream and part battle cry, Lucy shattered the supernatural bonds and rose into the air, her form blazing with borrowed power. "You want to feed on love?" she demanded, her voice echoing across dimensions. "Then feast on this." What happened next would have been impossible for any ordinary human, but Lucy was no longer entirely human. She opened her heart completely, dropping every defense and barrier, and let her love for Vincent pour out like molten gold. Not just her love, but the love of every woman who had ever died in this place. Isabella's fierce devotion, Vincent's grandmother's passionate loyalty, the desperate affection of a dozen other sacrificed brides, whose names had been forgotten, but whose emotions lived on in the stones themselves. The Guardian spirit recoiled as if struck by physical blows. What are you doing?" "Giving you exactly what you wanted," Lucy replied, her form now so bright with accumulated love and power that looking directly at her was like staring into the sun. "You feed on the corruption of love, on twisting beautiful emotions into something dark and poisonous. But what happens when love refuses to be corrupted? What happens when it burns so pure and bright that it illuminates all your shadows?" The ancient entity writhed in apparent agony as Lucy's purified emotions flooded the stone circle. For centuries, it had fed on love that had been tainted by fear, desperation, and the knowledge of inevitable doom. But the love Lucy was channeling held no trace of those darker elements. It was love freely given, love that demanded nothing in return, love that chose to fight rather than submit. "Stop," the Guardian pleaded, its voice now thin and reedy instead of cosmically powerful. "You're destroying me. This isn't how the game is played." "I'm not playing your game," Lucy said, advancing on the writhing shadow form with implacable purpose. "I'm writing new rules." But the entity had one final gambit, and it was the cruelest one possible. Suddenly the air filled with the forms of every woman who had ever died loving an Ashworth man, their ghostly figures surrounding Lucy in a circle of infinite sorrow. "Look at them," the Guardian whispered, its voice weak but still venomous. "Look at what your victory will cost. I am the only thing keeping their souls tethered to existence. Destroy me and they all fade into nothingness. Even your precious Isabella will be lost forever, scattered to the cosmic winds with no hope of rest or reunion." Lucy felt the weight of that revelation like a physical blow. She looked around the circle of ghostly women, seeing not just Isabella but generations of sacrificed brides, whose only crime had been falling in love with the wrong family. They looked back at her with expressions of infinite sadness and desperate hope, caught between existence and oblivion by forces they had never understood. "Choose quickly," the Guardian hissed, sensing her uncertainty. "Destroy me and condemn them all to eternal dissolution, or submit to preserve what little afterlife they have managed to cling to. Either way, I win." For a moment, Lucy wavered. The thought of condemning Isabella and all the other women to complete annihilation was almost unbearable. They had suffered enough in life. Didn't they deserve at least the comfort of ghostly existence? But then Isabella's voice rang out across the circle, clear and strong and filled with the kind of love that could move mountains. "Lucy, don't you dare sacrifice yourself for us," she said, her ghostly form blazing with its own inner light. "We've been trapped in this half-existence for centuries, unable to rest because our deaths were never avenged, our murders never acknowledged. If destroying this creature means we fade into peace, then that's a gift, not a tragedy." The other ghostly women nodded in agreement, their faces serene despite the cosmic forces raging around them. Lucy realized that what the Guardian had presented as a threat was actually an offer of liberation, not just for the living, but for the dead who had been bound to this place by injustice and unfinished business. "You're right," Lucy said to Isabella, her voice filled with profound love and respect. "You've all earned your rest." She turned back to the Guardian spirit, her resolve strengthened by the blessing of the dead. "Your hold on them ends now. Your hold on the Ashworth line ends now." "Your hold on me never existed," Lucy declared, and struck with every ounce of power she had accumulated during weeks of training and minutes of supernatural combat. The attack wasn't physical or even magical in any traditional sense. It was pure will made manifest, the absolute refusal to be anything other than free. Lucy poured every lesson Isabella had taught her into the assault, every moment of love she had shared with Vincent, every instant of courage she had discovered in her own heart. The Guardian spirit's final scream shattered the ancient stones, sending cracks racing through granite that had stood for millennia. Its form dissolved like smoke in a hurricane, its power scattered to the cosmic winds it had threatened to consign the ghostly women to. And as it died, something beautiful happened. The circle of ghostly brides began to glow with soft golden light. Their forms became more solid, more present, but also somehow lighter. The pain and terror that had defined their existence for so long melted away, replaced by the kind of peace that comes from knowing justice has finally been served. "Thank you," Isabella whispered as she approached Lucy, her ghostly form already beginning to fade into something brighter and more wonderful. "Thank you for giving us all the ending we deserved." One by one, the ghostly women approached Lucy, each offering their own words of gratitude and blessing, before dissolving into points of light that rose toward the star-scattered sky. They were going somewhere better now, somewhere the Guardian spirit could never follow. Isabella lingered the longest, turning to Vincent with an expression of profound love and infinite forgiveness. "Take care of her," she said, her voice already echoing from a great distance. "Love her with all the courage you couldn't show me, all the faith you were afraid to have. And Vincent, be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you." Then she too faded into light, leaving Lucy and Vincent alone in the shattered remains of the stone circle. Lucy swayed on her feet as the supernatural energies that had sustained her during the battle finally dissipated. The power was gone, flowing back to whatever cosmic sources had lent it to her for this one crucial confrontation. She was mortal again, human again, exhausted beyond measure but triumphantly, gloriously alive. Vincent was beside her in an instant, catching her as she stumbled and pulling her against his chest with desperate relief. They clung to each other in the ruins of the ancient circle, both of them shaking with the magnitude of what had just transpired. "Is it over?" Vincent asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Is it really over?" Lucy lifted her face to his, and Vincent saw in her dark eyes not the otherworldly power that had blazed there during the battle, but something even more beautiful, the simple, human love of a woman who had fought for the right to choose her own destiny and won. "It's over," she confirmed, her voice barely above a whisper. "The curse is broken. The Guardian is destroyed. We're free." Vincent kissed her then, and the kiss tasted of victory and new beginnings, and the kind of love that could survive even cosmic horror. Around them, the shattered stones began to crumble. Their supernatural purpose finally ended after centuries of hosting dark rituals. But Lucy and Vincent barely noticed the destruction. They had won something far more precious than the right to love without fear. They had won the right to build a future together, to write their own story without the interference of ancient evils or family curses. As dawn broke over the Yorkshire moors, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, they walked away from the ruined stone circle hand in hand. Behind them, the last fragments of the Guardian's influence crumbled to dust, and ahead of them lay all the possibilities that love could create when it was finally, completely free. The curse that had plagued the Ashworth line for nearly 2 centuries was broken forever. And Lucy Rivers, no longer a foundling, no longer alone, no longer afraid, walked into her new life as Vincent's equal, his partner, his chosen bride who had chosen him in return. They drove back to Ravenshollow Manor in comfortable silence, both too emotionally drained to speak, but drawing strength from each other's presence. The house looked different in the morning light, less gothic and forbidding, more like a home that had finally been freed from the shadows of its past. "What happens now?" Lucy asked as Vincent helped her from the car, her legs still unsteady from the night's ordeal. Vincent looked at the manor that had been both his prison and his sanctuary, then at the woman who had transformed it into something else entirely, a place where love could flourish instead of die. "Now," he said, taking her hands in his and feeling the solid warmth of her fingers intertwined with his own, "we live. We love each other without fear. We build something beautiful together, and we prove that some curses can be broken by those brave enough to believe in better endings." Lucy smiled, the expression radiant with exhaustion and joy, and the bone-deep satisfaction that comes from fighting for something precious and winning. "I like the sound of that." They stood together on the threshold of Ravenshollow Manor as the sun rose fully above the horizon, painting the ancient stones gold and chasing away the last shadows of supernatural dread. The house itself seemed to sigh with relief, its atmosphere lightening as the dark influences that had plagued it for generations finally lifted. Inside, they found that the covered mirrors had somehow uncovered themselves, reflecting not ghosts or curses, but simply the faces of 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds and refused to let anything, living or dead, human or supernatural, tear them apart. The battle was over. The curse was broken, and Lucy Rivers and Vincent Ashworth were finally, gloriously, completely free to love each other without reservation or fear. But as they stood in the entrance hall of the manor that would now become their true home rather than their prison, both of them understood that this ending was also a beginning. They had won the right to write their own story, and they intended to make it a masterpiece. The real adventure, the adventure of building a life together based on choice rather than fate, love rather than obligation, hope rather than fear, was just beginning. And Lucy had never been more ready for an adventure in her life. Vincent drew her close, marveling at the miracle of her presence in his arms, alive and whole, and his by her own free will rather than supernatural compulsion. Tomorrow they would begin the practical business of building their future together, planning a wedding that would be a celebration rather than a sacrifice, discussing whether to keep Ravenshollow Manor or find somewhere new to begin their married life, deciding how to use Vincent's wealth in ways that created rather than destroyed. But tonight, they would simply hold each other and marvel at the fact that they had both survived to see another dawn. They would make love not with the desperate urgency of the condemned, but with the leisurely passion of those who knew they had all the time in the world to explore the depths of their connection. The curse was broken, the guardian destroyed, and love, pure, freely chosen, unconquerable love, had triumphed over forces that had seemed insurmountable. Lucy Rivers had come to Ravenshollow Manor as a servant seeking employment. She was leaving it as a free woman who had fought cosmic evil and won, ready to begin the greatest adventure of her life with the man she had chosen to love. And as the morning sun streamed through the no longer cursed windows of the ancient manor, both Lucy and Vincent knew with absolute certainty that their story, their real story, the one they would write together, was only just beginning. The darkness had been conquered. The light had won. And love, as it always does when it's brave enough to fight for itself, had found a way to triumph over everything that sought to destroy it. They were free, they were together, and they were finally, wonderfully, completely home. The first weeks after the battle were a time of profound adjustment, as if Lucy and Vincent were learning to breathe in an atmosphere that no longer carried the weight of supernatural dread. Ravenshollow Manor transformed around them with each passing day, becoming less of a Gothic monument to tragedy and more of a home where laughter could echo through halls that had known only sorrow for too long. Lucy recovered from the supernatural ordeal more quickly than Vincent had dared to hope, though the experience had left its marks. She moved with a new kind of confidence, as if facing down cosmic horror had burned away the last vestiges of the frightened, abandoned girl she had once been. Her sensitivity to spiritual energies remained, but it no longer felt like a burden. Instead, it had become a gift that allowed her to sense the profound peace that now permeated the ancient house. Vincent watched her transformation with a mixture of awe and deep, abiding love. The woman who had served him breakfast that first morning had been beautiful in her quiet strength, but the woman who had literally battled the forces of darkness for the right to choose her own destiny was magnificent in ways that took his breath away. She was still gentle, still caring, still possessed of the nurturing instincts that had drawn him to her initially. But now those qualities were backed by an unshakable core of steel that made her his equal in every way that mattered. The change in their relationship was subtle but profound. Where once Lucy had deferred to Vincent's position and authority, now she challenged him when she disagreed, offered her own opinions without hesitation, and took the lead in decisions that affected their shared future. Vincent found this new dynamic exhilarating rather than threatening. For the first time in his adult life, he had a true partner rather than a dependent or an employee. It was Lucy who suggested the first major change to their lives, bringing it up over breakfast 3 weeks after Halloween, as autumn sunlight streamed through windows that no longer seemed to weep with perpetual sorrow. "I've been thinking about your work," she said, setting down her coffee cup with the deliberate precision that Vincent had learned meant she was preparing to say something important. "About the Manchester project and the families you were planning to displace." Vincent looked up from his morning correspondence, noting the thoughtful expression on her face. "The preservation order has stalled everything anyway. The local council is demanding an environmental impact study that could take months. What if that's not a setback but an opportunity?" Lucy asked, leaning forward with the intensity that always appeared when she was working through a complex problem. "What if instead of tearing down those Victorian terraces, you restored them, created affordable housing for the families who already live there, while preserving the historical character of the neighborhood?" The suggestion caught Vincent off guard, not because it was impractical, but because it represented such a fundamental shift from his usual approach to development. For 15 years, his business model had been built on acquisition, demolition, and replacement, buying properties cheap, tearing down what existed, and building something more profitable in its place. The idea of preservation and restoration went against every instinct he had developed as a businessman. But as he considered Lucy's proposal, Vincent realized it also represented something else, a chance to build rather than destroy, to create beauty rather than simply pursue profit. The curse that had driven his family to accumulate wealth at any cost was broken now, Perhaps it was time to discover what kind of man he could be when he wasn't driven by supernatural compulsions and generational guilt. "It would be expensive," he said finally, though his tone suggested he was already intrigued by the possibilities. "Restoration always costs more than demolition and replacement." Lucy smiled, the expression radiant with the kind of hope that could transform entire worlds. "You have more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes, Vincent. What's the point of wealth if you don't use it to make things better?" Over the following weeks, Vincent threw himself into reimagining the Manchester project, with the same intensity he had once brought to his more destructive ventures. He hired architects who specialized in historical preservation, consulted with urban planning experts who understood the importance of maintaining community character, and, most importantly, actually spoke to the residents whose lives would be affected by whatever he chose to build. The process was revolutionary for a man who had spent his career viewing property development as a zero-sum game, where his profit necessarily meant someone else's loss. But as Vincent worked with families to understand their needs, collaborated with local artists to design public spaces that would enhance rather than replace the existing neighborhood character, he discovered something unexpected. This approach was not only more ethical, it was also more personally fulfilling than anything he had ever done. Lucy accompanied him to Manchester for many of these meetings, and Vincent watched with growing admiration as she effortlessly connected with people from all walks of life. Her years of caring for others had given her an intuitive understanding of what people needed to feel safe and valued in their homes. More than once, her suggestions about community gardens, shared spaces, and child-friendly design elements proved to be exactly what turned skeptical residents into enthusiastic supporters of the project. "You're a natural at this," Vincent told her one evening as they drove back to Yorkshire after a particularly productive community meeting. "Have you ever considered making it more than just occasional assistance?" Lucy looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean becoming my business partner," Vincent said, the words coming out in a rush as he realized how much he wanted her to say yes, not just in name but in practice. "Your insights about what makes spaces livable, your ability to connect with people, your instinct for creating beauty instead of simply pursuing profit. I need all of that if I'm going to transform my business into something worthy of the life we're building together." The offer surprised Lucy, though as she considered it, she realized it also felt right in a way that pure domestic life never quite had. She had spent her entire adult life caring for others, but always in service roles where her opinions and insights were valued only insofar as they served someone else's agenda. The idea of being Vincent's equal partner in creating something meaningful appealed to parts of herself she was only just beginning to discover. "Equal partners?" she asked, and Vincent heard both hope and challenge in her voice. "Equal partners," he confirmed without hesitation, "in business and in life. I've spent too many years making decisions in isolation, and look where it led me. I don't want to be that man anymore." Lucy's smile was answer enough, but she said the words anyway, because they both needed to hear them spoken aloud. Yes, I want to build something beautiful with you." Their engagement, when it came, was both inevitable and surprising in its timing. Vincent had been planning to propose for weeks, carrying his grandmother's engagement ring in his pocket like a talisman, while he searched for the perfect moment and the perfect words. In the end, the moment chose itself. They were working late in Vincent's study, now their shared office, reviewing architectural plans for the Manchester project when Lucia suddenly looked up from her sketches with an expression of pure joy. "This is going to work," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "All of it. The restoration, the community spaces, the affordable housing integrated with the historical preservation. We're actually going to create something that makes people's lives better, instead of displacing them for profit." Vincent looked at her across the desk they now shared, seeing not just the woman he loved but the partner who had helped him discover possibilities he never would have imagined on his own. The ring was in his pocket, the words were on his tongue, but suddenly all his careful plans seemed inadequate to the magnitude of what he was feeling. "Lucy," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I love you beyond measure. I love your courage and your kindness, and the way you see possibilities where others see only problems. I love how you challenge me to be better than I thought I could be, and I love how you never let me settle for less than the truth, even when the truth is difficult." Lucy looked up from her sketches, something in his tone alerting her to the significance of the moment. "Vincent?" He came around the desk to kneel beside her chair, pulling the antique ring from his pocket with hands that trembled slightly. "I love you for choosing me when you could have chosen safety, for fighting cosmic horror to protect what we have, for seeing beauty in a broken man and a cursed house. Lucy Rivers, will you marry me? Will you be my partner in everything, for as long as we both shall live?" The ring was exquisite, a Victorian setting with a central diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the lamplight like captured stars. But Lucy barely saw it through the tears that sprang to her eyes at Vincent's words. "Yes," she whispered, then said it again more firmly. "Yes, Vincent Ashworth, I will marry you. I will be your partner, and your equal and your fiercest advocate for as long as there is breath in my body." The kiss that sealed their engagement was different from all the ones that had come before, not desperate or urgent or shadowed by supernatural threat. But joyful and certain and full of promises, they finally had the freedom to keep. When they broke apart, both were laughing through their tears, giddy with the simple miracle of being alive and in love, and free to plan a future together. The wedding preparations became a celebration, not just of their love, but of the transformation they had both undergone. Lucy insisted on being involved in every detail, not because she doubted Vincent's judgment, but because this was their wedding, their celebration, their public declaration of partnership. They chose to hold the ceremony at Ravenshollow Manor, but in the gardens rather than inside the house, symbolically stepping out of the shadows of the past and into the light of their shared future. Vincent's business associates were puzzled by the change in his approach to both work and personal life, but his friends, the few real ones he had managed to maintain through years of self-imposed isolation, were delighted by the transformation they witnessed. Lucy's presence had softened Vincent's harder edges without diminishing his strength, while Vincent's support had allowed Lucy to blossom into the confident, capable woman she had always been meant to become. The guest list was deliberately small and intimate, people who had supported them individually and now celebrated their union. Mrs. Hartwell from the village post office, who had become something of a surrogate grandmother to Lucy. James Morrison, Vincent's architect, and one of the few people who had continued to check on him during his years of grief-driven isolation. Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, the local GP who had treated both Vincent's depression and Lucy's exhaustion after the supernatural battle, and who had become a close friend to both of them. But the most important guests were the ones no one else could see, the spirits of Isabella and the other Ashworth brides, who appeared as gentle presences blessing the union that had finally broken the cycle of tragedy that had defined their family for generations. Lucy felt their approval like warm sunlight on her skin as she walked down the garden path in her wedding dress, and Vincent saw them in his peripheral vision, smiling with the joy of those who had finally found peace. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its simplicity. Lucy had chosen a dress of ivory silk that complemented her dark hair and pale skin without overwhelming her petite frame. Vincent wore a classic black suit that emphasized his lean strength and the premature silver that had threaded through his hair during his years of grief. They had written their own vows, speaking words of commitment that acknowledged both the darkness they had survived and the light they intended to create together. "Lucy," Vincent said, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him, "I promise to be your partner in all things, in business, in love, in the daily work of building a life worth living. I promise to trust your strength, even when my instincts tell me to protect you, to support your dreams even when they challenge my assumptions, to love you not just for what you bring to my life, but for who you are in your own right." Lucy's voice was equally clear as she spoke her own vows. "Vincent, I promise to stand beside you as an equal, to challenge you when you need challenging, and support you when you need support. I promise to love you not despite your darkness, but because you've learned to transform it into something beautiful. I promise to build something meaningful with you, to face whatever challenges come our way, and to never forget that we chose each other freely, without compulsion or supernatural influence." When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was witnessed not only by their living guests, but by a generation of women whose own love stories had been cut tragically short. As Vincent and Lucy embraced, the ghostly figures faded into points of light that rose toward the sky, like blessings made visible. The reception that followed was intimate and joyful, filled with the kind of laughter that had never echoed through Ravenshollow Manor during its long history. Lucy and Vincent danced to music that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, lost in each other's eyes while their guests looked on with the satisfaction of those who had witnessed something truly magical. But it was later, when they were finally alone in the master bedroom that had been redecorated to reflect both their personalities rather than just Vincent's grief, that the true significance of their union became clear. They made love as husband and wife for the first time, with a passion that was both tender and fierce, claiming each other completely while celebrating the freedom to do so without fear of supernatural consequences. "I love you." "To Mrs. Ashworth," Vincent murmured against Lucy's throat as they lay entwined in the aftermath of their lovemaking. "I love you too, Mr. Ashworth," Lucy replied, running her fingers through his dark hair. "And I love that we get to spend the rest of our lives proving it to each other." The months that followed their wedding were a time of unprecedented happiness and productivity. The Manchester Restoration Project became a model for sustainable urban development, winning awards for its innovative approach to balancing historical preservation with modern housing needs. Other developers began seeking Vincent and Lucy's consultation on similar projects, and what had started as a single renovation grew into a thriving business built on principles of community enhancement rather than displacement. Lucy proved to be every bit as brilliant at the business side of their ventures as she was at the human elements. Her years of managing household budgets and stretching limited resources translated into an intuitive understanding of cost-effective construction methods and efficient project management. More importantly, her ability to envision how spaces would feel to the people who lived in them helped them create environments that were not just profitable, but genuinely nurturing to human flourishing. Their personal life flourished alongside their professional partnership. Ravenshollow Manor, freed from the supernatural influences that had haunted it for generations, became a true home, a place where friends gathered for dinner parties, where Vincent's business associates came to understand that his new approach to development was both more ethical and more profitable than his previous methods, where Lucy finally had the domestic stability she had craved throughout her childhood in institutional care. But perhaps the most profound change was in Vincent himself. The man who had once been known for his ruthless business practices and emotional unavailability became someone his friends and colleagues barely recognized. He laughed more, worried less, and approached both business and personal challenges with a confidence that came not from dominance, but from partnership. Having Lucy as his equal, rather than his dependent, had freed him from the exhausting burden of trying to control everything and everyone around him. "You've changed him," Dr. Thornton observed to Lucy during one of their regular dinners at the manor. "Not just made him happy, but actually changed who he is at his core." Lucy smiled, glancing across the dining room to where Vincent was engaged in an animated conversation with James Morrison about incorporating solar panels into their next restoration project. "He changed me too. That's what real partnership does. It transforms both people into better versions of themselves." The first year of their marriage brought challenges alongside the joys, learning to merge two very different approaches to decision-making, navigating the complexities of running a business together while maintaining their romantic relationship, adjusting to the public attention that came with their innovative approach to development. But each challenge they faced only seemed to strengthen their bond, proving that they were indeed better together than either of them had ever been alone. It was during their first wedding anniversary celebration that Lucy made an announcement that surprised even Vincent, though he realized afterward that he should have seen it coming. "I have something to tell you," she said as they sat in the garden where they had been married exactly 1 year earlier, sharing a bottle of champagne while the autumn evening painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Vincent looked at her with the attention he had learned to give whenever Lucy used that particular tone. "What is it?" Lucy took his hands in hers, her dark eyes bright with a joy that seemed to radiate from her very soul. "We're going to have a baby." The words hit Vincent like a physical blow, not because he was unhappy, but because the happiness was so intense it left him momentarily breathless. For 3 years after Isabella's death, he had convinced himself that he would never be a father, that the Ashworth line would end with him rather than risk passing the family curse to another generation. But the curse was broken now, destroyed by Lucy's courage and their love for each other. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "Our baby, free and clear, with no shadows hanging over their future." "Our baby," Lucy confirmed, lifting their joined hands to her still flat stomach. "Due in the spring, when everything comes back to life." Vincent kissed her then with all the love and gratitude and sheer exuberant joy he possessed, while the ghosts of Ravenshollow Manor, now benevolent presences rather than tormented souls, seemed to smile their approval from whatever realm they now inhabited. The pregnancy progressed normally, a fact that both Vincent and Lucy found alternately reassuring and miraculous. After generations of supernatural interference in Ashworth reproduction, the simple biological process of creating new life felt like a daily gift. Lucy bloomed with expectant motherhood, her natural nurturing instincts enhanced by the knowledge that she was carrying a child who would grow up free from the darkness that had shadowed their family for centuries. Vincent proved to be an attentive and devoted expectant father, though his protectiveness sometimes bordered on the obsessive, until Lucy gently reminded him that pregnancy was not an illness requiring treatment, but a natural process to be celebrated. He threw himself into preparing the nursery with the same intensity he brought to their business ventures, consulting child development experts about optimal color schemes and reading every book on parenting he could find. "You realize you're going to have to trust me to raise this child too, don't you?" Lucy teased him one evening as he assembled what appeared to be a crib designed by aerospace engineers. "Partnership means sharing the parenting duties as well as everything else." Vincent looked up from the instruction manual, his hair disheveled and his expression slightly wild. "I know, I want everything to be perfect for them. They're going to be the first Ashworth child born free in over a century. That feels like a responsibility I can't take lightly." Lucy moved to where he sat surrounded by crib components and perched on his lap, running her fingers through his hair to smooth it back into order. "They're going to be perfect because they're ours. Because they'll be born into love instead of fear, raised by parents who chose each other freely and who will teach them to make their own choices. The fact that they're an Ashworth is just one part of who they'll be. It doesn't have to define their entire existence the way it defined yours." The wisdom in her words helped Vincent find his center again, reminding him that the point of breaking the family curse had been to free future generations from its influence, not to create new pressures and expectations. Their child would be loved unconditionally, supported in whatever path they chose to pursue, and raised with the knowledge that they had the right to write their own story without interference from supernatural forces or family legacies. Elizabeth Rose Ashworth was born on a bright April morning, after a labor that was difficult but blessedly normal. Vincent held his daughter for the first time with tears streaming down his face, marveling at the tiny fingers that gripped his thumb with surprising strength and the dark eyes that seemed to look at him with ancient wisdom. "She's perfect," he whispered to Lucy, who watched them both with the exhausted contentment of new motherhood. "Absolutely perfect." "She's ours," Lucy replied, and in those simple words was contained all the miracle of their love, made manifest in human form. The first months of Elizabeth's life were filled with the usual challenges of new parenthood, but also with a profound sense of completion that both Vincent and Lucy had never expected to experience. Ravenshollow Manor echoed with the sounds of infant crying, childhood laughter, and the constant background noise of a house that was truly alive with family rather than haunted by tragedy. Vincent proved to be a devoted father, though his parenting style was quite different from Lucy's more intuitive approach. Where she instinctively knew when Elizabeth was hungry or tired, Vincent approached child-rearing with the same methodical attention to detail he brought to architectural restoration. Both approaches worked, and their daughter thrived under the combined influence of Lucy's nurturing warmth and Vincent's protective devotion. More importantly, Elizabeth showed no signs of the supernatural sensitivity that had plagued previous generations of the Ashworth line. She was simply a normal, healthy, happy baby who slept through the night, smiled at anyone who held her, and displayed the kind of sunny temperament that suggested she had inherited the best qualities of both her parents while being burdened by none of their historical baggage. As Elizabeth grew from infant to toddler, Vincent and Lucy's business expanded beyond their wildest expectations. Their success with the Manchester project had attracted attention from developers across England who wanted to learn their methods for community-centered restoration. They found themselves consulting on projects from Cornwall to Scotland, helping transform urban planning from a process that displaced communities to one that strengthened them. The work was fulfilling in ways that Vincent's previous career had never been, but more importantly, it allowed them to model the kind of partnership they wanted Elizabeth to understand as normal. Their daughter grew up watching her parents work together as equals, seeing them disagree without animosity and support each other's individual strengths while building something beautiful together. "She'll never know how unusual this is," Vincent observed one evening as they watched 3-year-old Elizabeth play with building blocks in their shared office, constructing elaborate structures with the focused concentration of a born architect. "Good," Lucy replied, looking up from the development proposals she was reviewing. "She should think that parents who love and respect each other are perfectly ordinary. She should expect any future partner to treat her as an equal and be surprised by anything less." It was a philosophy they carried into every aspect of Elizabeth's upbringing. She learned to expect that her opinions would be heard and valued, that her dreams would be supported regardless of how ambitious they might be. That love was something freely given, rather than earned through compliance or performance. She grew up bilingual in both English and the language of construction and design, equally comfortable discussing sustainable building materials and fairy tale princesses. By the time Elizabeth started school, Vincent and Lucy's business had grown into one of the most respected development firms in the country. They had offices in London and Manchester, a staff of architects and planners who shared their vision for community-centered development, and a waiting list of clients who wanted their particular combination of historical preservation and modern innovation. But their greatest success remained their marriage and their family. They had built something beautiful and lasting from the ruins of generational trauma, proving that some curses could indeed be broken by those brave enough to choose love over fear, partnership over domination, healing over revenge. On their 5th wedding anniversary, they returned to the site where the ancient stone circle had once stood. The area had been naturally reclaimed by the Yorkshire landscape. Wildflowers grew where the guardian spirit had once held court, and a small stream bubbled cheerfully through the space where Lucy had faced down cosmic horror to claim the right to determine her own destiny. "Do you ever regret it?" Vincent asked, as they stood hand in hand watching Elizabeth chase butterflies through the meadow grass. "Choosing a life that's essentially ordinary after experiencing something so extraordinary?" Lucy smiled, thinking of their full, busy, wonderfully mundane days filled with client meetings, school plays, bedtime stories, and the million small negotiations that made up a successful marriage and business partnership. "This isn't ordinary," she said, gesturing to encompass Elizabeth's laughter, the peaceful landscape, the comfortable weight of Vincent's wedding ring on her finger. "This is miraculous. We chose each other freely. We're raising a daughter who will never know fear as a daily companion. We're building things that make the world better instead of worse. If that's not magic, I don't know what is." Vincent squeezed her hand, thinking of the man he had been 5 years earlier. Bitter, isolated, convinced that love was a luxury he could never afford. The transformation seemed impossible even to him sometimes, but the evidence was all around them. Elizabeth's joyful shrieks as she discovered a patch of wild strawberries, the portfolio of successful projects that bore both their names, the easy affection that still sparked between them after years of marriage and partnership. "I love you, Lucy Ashworth," he said, using the name she had chosen to keep, even as she insisted on equal partnership in everything else. "I love you too." "Vincent Ashworth," she replied, then called to their daughter, "Elizabeth, come tell us about the butterflies." Their daughter bounded over with the inexhaustible energy of childhood, chattering about the different species she had observed, and asking if they could plant flowers at home that would attract more butterflies to their garden. As Vincent lifted Elizabeth onto his shoulders and Lucy gathered the wildflowers she had picked for her mother. They made their way back toward the car and the life they had built together. Behind them, the meadow where the stone circle had once stood seemed to shimmer with approval, as if the very landscape was celebrating the love story